Tonight, before we journey into the Buddha's wisdom, we first create a sanctuary of stillness. This moment right here is your transition from the doing of the day into the being of the night. Let everything that came before fall away. Let everything that might come tomorrow wait outside this space. Welcome to Buddha Bedtime Stories. This is where you come not to learn or accomplish, but simply to rest in the presence of ancient wisdom. I'd love to know, what time is it where you are, and where in the world are you settling in to listen tonight? Please share in the comments below. Feel yourself arriving here fully. Notice how your body has been carrying you all day, holding tension you didn't even know was there. This is your invitation to finally completely let go. The Buddha's teachings we'll explore tonight begin not with effort, but with this very releasing, this softening into what is. Before any words, before any stories, there is just this. Your breath, your body, this present moment. Rest here first. Let the stillness find you. There's no rush. The teachings will wait while you settle into the peace that's already here, beneath everything. Now, give yourself permission to get truly, deeply comfortable. Adjust your position until your body whispers, yes, this is right. Feel the weight of your head on the pillow, the way the bed or chair holds you completely. You are supported. You can let go. Take a long, slow breath in, feeling your entire body expand with the inhale. Hold it gently at the top, then release it all, feeling yourself sink deeper into rest with the exhale. Again, breathing in peace, breathing out the last remnants of the day. And once more, this time letting the exhale carry you even deeper into stillness. Feel that? That quiet that's settling over you? Rest here for just a moment longer. This calm is your foundation. From this place of rest, we'll now receive the Buddha's teachings. Let us begin with our first story. In the capital city, there was a mirror maker named Eiji, who had perfected his craft over decades. His mirrors were renowned for their clarity. When you looked into one of Eiji's mirrors, you saw yourself exactly as you were. No distortion, no wavering, no cloudiness. Just pure, clear reflection. But Eiji had a strange habit that puzzled his apprentices. After crafting each mirror, after polishing it to perfect clarity, he would sit before it for an hour just looking, not at his own reflection, but at the mirror itself. Or so it seemed. When asked what he was doing, he would only smile and say, "I'm learning from it." One day, a young apprentice named Hannah gathered her courage and asked directly, "Master, what does a mirror have to teach? It only reflects what's placed before it." Eiji gestured for her to sit beside him in front of a newly completed mirror. "Look at this mirror," he said. "What do you see?" "I see my reflection," Hannah replied. "Yes. And what does the mirror think about your reflection?" Hannah frowned. "Mirrors don't think." "Exactly. The mirror doesn't think you're beautiful or ugly. It doesn't judge you as good or bad. It doesn't prefer one face over another. It simply reflects what is without adding anything of its own. This is the mirror's teaching." He stood up and moved away, leaving the mirror empty of human reflections. "Now what does it reflect?" he asked. "The wall behind it, the window, the light. And does it complain that the wall is less interesting than a human face?" Does it wish the light would be different? Does it try to improve what it reflects? No, Hannah said slowly, beginning to understand. It just reflects whatever appears before it, without preference. This, Agi said, sitting back down, is how I try to experience life. Like a mirror, awareness that reflects everything, without distortion, without judgment, without trying to change what appears. Hannah thought about this. But we're not mirrors. We have thoughts, feelings, preferences. We judge constantly. Yes, Agi agreed, but beneath all those thoughts and judgments is pure awareness, the part of you that simply sees, simply knows, simply experiences without adding commentary. This awareness is like a mirror. It reflects your thoughts, but it doesn't judge them. It reflects your feelings, but it doesn't resist them. It reflects reality, but it doesn't try to change it into something else. He pointed to the mirror again. When you look in this mirror, it shows you exactly what you are in this moment. If you smile, it shows you smiling. If you frown, it shows you frowning. It doesn't try to make you smile when you're sad. It doesn't criticize you for frowning. It just faithfully, honestly, clearly reflects what is. Hannah stared at the mirror, seeing herself reflected there. She noticed how her mind immediately started judging what she saw. Her nose was too wide, her hair was messy, she looked tired. But the mirror itself held no such judgments. It simply showed her face with perfect neutrality. The suffering we create, Agi continued, comes largely from our inability to be like mirrors. We see what is, and immediately we add our opinions about what is. We see a thought, and we judge it as good or bad. We see a feeling, and we resist it or cling to it. We see reality, and we compare it to how we think it should be. All of this is distortion, adding things that aren't really there. He stood and walked to where several mirrors stood in various stages of completion. He picked up one that was cloudy, its surface rough. "This mirror distorts," he said, showing Hannah the wavy, unclear reflection it produced. "When you look in it, you can't see yourself clearly. Your image is bent, confused. This is what our minds do when they're full of judgment and resistance and preferences. We can't see reality clearly because we're constantly bending it, distorting it, making it into something that confirms our beliefs." He set down the cloudy mirror and picked up one that was highly polished. "But this mirror," he held it up, showing Hannah her clear reflection, "adds nothing. It has no agenda. It doesn't care what appears before it. It just faithfully reflects moment by moment whatever is present. And in that faithful reflection, there's a kind of peace." Over the following weeks, Hannah began to practice what she called mirror awareness. When thoughts appeared in her mind, instead of immediately judging them or getting caught up in their content, she would try to simply reflect them, to be aware that thinking was happening without adding a second layer of thought about the first layer. When emotions arose, instead of immediately trying to push them away or figure out why she was feeling them, she would try to simply reflect them, to notice that sadness was present or anger was present, the way a mirror might notice a cloud passing across its surface. It was harder than she expected. Her mind wanted to comment on everything, to judge, to analyze, to fix. But gradually, she learned to find that space of pure awareness beneath all the commentary. And she discovered that Agi was right. There was a peace in simply reflecting reality without trying to change it. One evening, a wealthy merchant came to Eiji's workshop in great distress. He had commissioned an elaborate mirror for his home, but when Eiji delivered it, the merchant had rejected it. "This mirror makes me look old," the merchant complained. "It shows every flaw, every line on my face. I want a mirror that makes me look better." Eiji listened patiently, then said gently, "The mirror shows you exactly as you are. If you look old, it's because you are aging, as all humans do. The mirror doesn't judge this as good or bad. It simply reflects truth." "Then I don't want truth," the merchant said angrily. "I want to look young and handsome." "I could make you a distorted mirror," Eiji offered. "One that softens lines and changes proportions. It would lie to you, but perhaps that would make you happier." The merchant paused, realizing how foolish he sounded. He looked at himself in the clear mirror again, really looked. Yes, he was aging. Yes, there were lines on his face, but the mirror wasn't judging him. Only he was judging himself. "The mirror accepts you exactly as you are," Eiji said softly. "Perhaps you could learn to do the same." The merchant stood there for a long time, looking at his reflection without judgment, trying to see himself the way the mirror saw him. Just a face, just a person, just what is, without the weight of good or bad, young or old, handsome or ugly. Finally, he nodded. "I'll take the mirror," he said quietly. Years later, when Hana had become a master mirror maker herself, students would ask her the same question she had once asked Eiji. "What does a mirror have to teach?" And she would reply, just as Eiji had, "A mirror teaches us pure awareness. It shows us that we can experience life without constantly judging it, resisting it, trying to change it into something else. We can simply reflect what is, clearly and faithfully, without distortion. And in that clear reflection, we find a peace that judgment can never provide." She would hold up a polished mirror, turning it so light played across its surface. "Your deepest nature is like this mirror, pure awareness that reflects everything but clings to nothing, that sees everything but judges nothing, that accepts everything exactly as it is. When you can rest in this mirror-like awareness, even for a moment, you discover that peace doesn't depend on changing what you reflect. It depends on reflecting clearly, without adding the distortion of your own resistance and judgment." Tonight, as you rest, you might practice mirror awareness. Let thoughts appear and disappear like images crossing a mirror's surface. Let feelings rise and fall like reflections that come and go. Don't judge what appears. Don't try to change it. Just reflect it clearly, the way a mirror reflects light, faithfully, honestly, without adding anything of your own. You are not the content of your thoughts and feelings. You are the awareness that reflects them. And that awareness, like a perfect mirror, is always clear, always peaceful, always unchanged by whatever passes across its surface. Rest in your mirror nature tonight. Reflect everything, cling to nothing, judge nothing. Just be aware, purely and simply aware, and let that awareness be enough. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a tale about recognition and the true nature of worth. This is the next story. In a village where bread was the staple food, there lived a baker named Tomoe, who had learned the craft from her mother and grandmother. She took great pride in her work, waking before dawn each day to prepare dough, tend the oven, and produce loaves that the village depended on. Tomoe had baked thousands of loaves over the years, and she rarely made mistakes anymore. Her hands knew the feel of properly kneaded dough. Her eyes could judge oven temperature by the color of the fire. Her timing was precise. Day after day, she produced bread that was consistently good, reliable, exactly what people expected. But one morning, something went wrong. A neighbor had stopped by to talk just as Tomoe was loading loaves into the oven. Distracted by the conversation, she forgot about the bread. By the time she remembered, smoke was pouring from the oven. She pulled out loaf after loaf of burnt bread, each one blackened and ruined. Tomoe was devastated. In 15 years of baking, she had never destroyed an entire day's batch. The waste of ingredients troubled her. The loss of income for the day worried her. But most of all, her pride was wounded. She had been perfect for so long, and now she had failed in the most basic way. She sat among the burnt loaves, feeling terrible. Her young apprentice, a girl named Kiku, came in and saw the disaster. "What happened?" Kiku asked. "I forgot," Tomoe said miserably. "I was distracted and I forgot. After 15 years of baking, I made a beginner's mistake." Kiku picked up one of the burnt loaves, examining it. "So this is what happens when bread stays in the oven too long." "Yes, it's completely ruined, worthless." But Kiku was looking at it with fascination. She had been apprenticing for 6 months and had never seen burnt bread before. Tomoe was so skilled that mistakes never happened in her presence. "How much too long was it in there?" Kiku asked. Tomoe thought. "Perhaps 10 minutes passed when I should have removed it." And what if it had been 5 minutes too long instead of 10? Tomoe considered this. She had actually never experimented with deliberately over-baking bread, so she wasn't certain. "I suppose it would be burnt, but less severely. Could it still be eaten if it were only 5 minutes over?" "Perhaps if you cut away the worst parts." Kiku set down the burnt loaf and picked up another. "And this one is burnt differently than that one. Why?" Tomoe looked more carefully at the loaves she had been too upset to really examine. Kiku was right. They had been in different parts of the oven, so they had burnt in different ways. Some were charred uniformly. Others were only burnt on one side. Some had burnt crusts but soft interiors. Each loaf told a story about where it had been in the oven and how fire had affected it. "I've been baking for 6 months, Kiku said, "and I've only learned how to do things right. I've never learned what happens when things go wrong, but you just learned more in one mistake than I've learned in weeks of getting it right." Tomoe looked at her young apprentice with new appreciation. The girl had wisdom beyond her years. "You're right," Tomoe said slowly. "I've been so focused on perfection that I've stopped learning. Every loaf I bake comes out the same. I'm not growing or discovering anything new. I'm just repeating what I already know how to do." She stood up and examined the burnt loaves more systematically. "This one," she said, pointing, "was at the back of the oven where it's hottest. It burnt fastest. These along the side got less direct heat. They took longer to burn. And this one right in front, it actually caught fire briefly before I pulled it out." Kiku watched her teacher transform from defeated to curious, from ashamed to engaged. "You know what?" Tomo said. "I'm going to deliberately burn some bread. Different amounts, different positions in the oven, different types of dough. I'm going to learn what I don't know because I've been too careful to ever make these mistakes." Over the following weeks, Tomo conducted experiments that would have horrified her former perfectionist self. She deliberately overbaked loaves to see what happened. She underbaked some. She tried different temperatures, different positions in the oven, different lengths of time. She made every mistake she could think of, carefully observing the results. What she learned transformed her baking. She discovered that what she had called perfect was actually just one point on a spectrum of possibilities. She found that slightly underbaked bread had a chewier texture that some people preferred. She learned that bread with a darker crust had a richer flavor. She discovered techniques she never would have tried if she hadn't been forced out of her perfect routine by that first mistake. Her bread became more varied, more interesting, more responsive to what different customers wanted. People who had been eating her consistently good bread for years suddenly found themselves excited by it again. "What changed?" they would ask. "Your bread seems different lately." Tomo would smile and say, "I finally made a mistake. And that mistake taught me more than years of getting it right." One day, a traveling baker who was considered a master of the craft stopped at Tomo's shop. He tasted her bread and was impressed. "You understand bread deeply," he said. "How did you learn so much?" "I burnt a whole day's batch," Tomo replied, "and instead of just feeling bad about it, I decided to learn from it. That mistake opened doors I didn't even know existed." The master baker nodded knowingly. The problem with being good at something is that you stop making mistakes. And when you stop making mistakes, you stop learning. You just keep repeating what you already know. It's the mistakes, if you pay attention to them, that show you what you don't yet understand. He looked around at her thriving shop. People think mastery means never making mistakes, but real mastery comes from making mistakes consciously, learning from them, and letting them teach you what success never can. Years later, when Kiku had become a skilled baker herself and taken over Tomo's shop, she would tell new apprentices about the day of the burnt bread. "My teacher was perfect for 15 years, she would say, and in those 15 years, her skill barely grew. But one mistake, one moment of failure, opened up years of new learning. Don't fear mistakes. Pay attention to them. They're often more valuable teachers than success." Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own burnt bread, the mistakes you've made, the failures you've experienced, the times things went wrong. Are you still punishing yourself for these mistakes? Still seeing them only as evidence of inadequacy? What if those mistakes were actually your best teachers? What if failure, when you pay attention to it, reveals possibilities that success keeps hidden? What if the things you did wrong showed you more than all the things you did right? You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to get everything right. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is make a mistake, pay attention to what happens, and let it teach you what you couldn't learn any other way. Rest now in acceptance of your imperfect humanity. Your mistakes are not failures. They're experiments, they're lessons, they're the burnt bread that teaches you something new about the oven of your own life. Let them nourish your wisdom instead of poisoning your peace. There was a poet named Ren who had written beautiful poems for many years. His words flowed easily. and people treasured his work. But one season, the words stopped coming. Ren would sit before blank paper, brush ready, ink prepared, and nothing would emerge. Day after day, week after week, the page remained empty. He tried everything. He read other poets' work, hoping for inspiration. He visited beautiful places, seeking images to capture. He forced himself to write, producing words that felt dead and hollow. Nothing worked. The emptiness persisted. Ren fell into despair. He believed he had lost his gift, that whatever spring of poetry had lived within him had dried up. He was no longer a poet, just someone sitting before blank pages, producing nothing. A Zen monk named Sengai heard of Ren's struggle and came to visit. He found the poet sitting in his study, surrounded by blank papers, looking defeated. "I can't write," Ren said. "The words are gone. I'm empty." Sengai picked up one of the blank pages, examining it carefully. "This paper looks full to me." Ren frowned. "It's completely blank. It's empty. That's the problem." "Is it?" Sengai held the page up to the light. "I see infinite possibilities on this page. I see every poem ever written and every poem yet to be written. I see your past work and your future work. This blank page contains everything. How can you call it empty?" "Those are just potential poems," Ren protested. "Not actual poems. Potential is nothing. I need actual words." Sengai set down the paper gently. "Tell me, before you write a poem, where does it exist?" "In my mind, I suppose. Or in my imagination." "And is that nothing? Is a poem that exists in imagination less real than a poem on paper? Or is it just a different form of the same thing?" Ren started to answer, then stopped. He wasn't sure. "The blank page is not the absence of poetry," Sengai continued. "It's poetry in its unmanifested form, the silence before the song, the stillness before the dance. You're calling it empty because you can't see it yet. But perhaps it's more full than any written page, because it contains all possibilities rather than one actuality." He moved to the window, looking out at Ren's garden. "In winter, your garden looks dead. Empty. But is it? Or is spring simply waiting, gathering itself, preparing? You wouldn't curse the winter garden for not being summer. You trust that the emptiness is part of the cycle. Why can't you trust that your blank pages are also part of the cycle?" Over the following days, Ren sat with this teaching. Instead of fighting the blankness, trying to force it to become fullness, he simply sat with it. He looked at blank pages not as failures, but as potential. He experienced his internal emptiness not as loss, but as space. And slowly, something shifted. The emptiness began to feel different. Not empty, but full of possibility. Not lacking, but pregnant with what might emerge. He stopped trying to write and simply sat with a blank page, befriending it, accepting it. One morning, without force or effort, words came. Not many, just a few lines, but they felt true in a way his forced writing hadn't. They emerged from the emptiness rather than being imposed upon it. The blank page had given birth naturally, rather than being violated by his demand. Ren's poetry changed after this period. It had more space in it, more silence between words. Critics said it had deepened, become more profound. Ren knew it was because he had learned to value emptiness as much as fullness, to see the blank page not as an enemy, but as a teacher. When young poets came to him struggling with their own blank pages, their own dry periods, Ren would tell them, "Don't curse the emptiness. Don't fight the blank page." Emptiness is not the absence of poetry. It's poetry gathering itself. It's the fullness before it manifests. Trust it. Sit with it. Let it fill you in ways that words never could. The blank page is not nothing. It's everything waiting. Tonight, let yourself be blank. Let your mind be the empty page, not filled with thoughts and plans and worries. Don't see this emptiness as a lack. See it as fullness waiting, as possibility gathering, as the silence before the song. You don't need to fill every moment with content. The empty moments are just as important, just as full in their own way. Rest in emptiness. It's not nothing. It's everything you need, waiting to emerge when the time is right. As we move deeper into the quiet teachings of Zen, we come to a story about seeing clearly and understanding true value. Listen carefully to the next story. In a famous garden known for its roses, there appeared one season a strange mutation, a rose bush with no thorns. The stems were completely smooth, the flowers beautiful, but there was no defense, no sharp points to protect the plant from being damaged. The gardener, a woman named Ayame, was fascinated by this thornless rose. She thought it was perfect, an improvement over regular roses. Who wouldn't want roses without thorns? Roses that you could handle freely, cut without care, and arrange without risk of being pricked. She took cuttings from the thornless rose and propagated them, creating a whole section of the garden filled with these defenseless plants. She was so proud of this achievement that she invited people from across the region to see her thornless roses. But within a few months, problems appeared. Deer, which usually avoided the thorny roses, ate the thornless ones freely. Insects that were discouraged by thorns colonized these plants without resistance. Careless visitors would grab handfuls of flowers, taking far more than they would have if thorns had made them cautious. Within a year, the thornless roses were struggling. They required constant human protection, constant intervention, constant care in ways that regular roses never needed. What had seemed like an improvement turned out to be a vulnerability, a visiting botanist explained to Ayame. The thorns weren't a flaw in the design. They were part of the wisdom of the design. The rose needs protection because it's beautiful and therefore desirable. The thorns say, "Appreciate me from a respectful distance. If you want my beauty, approach carefully with awareness. Without that protection, the rose is too vulnerable to survive." Ayame was defensive at first, but thorns hurt people. Wouldn't it be better to have roses without danger? Danger isn't the only reason for boundaries, the botanist replied. The thorns create an appropriate relationship. They don't prevent you from enjoying the rose. They just require you to be careful, to pay attention, to approach with awareness rather than grabbing carelessly. The thornless rose invites carelessness, and carelessness destroys it. Ayame began to see the thornless roses differently. What she had thought was an improvement was actually a mutation that made the plant unable to protect itself. And that inability to protect itself meant the plant couldn't thrive. She noticed similar patterns in human behavior. People who had no boundaries, no ability to say no, no thorns to protect themselves, often ended up depleted and taken advantage of. Like her thornless roses, they needed constant intervention to survive because they couldn't protect themselves naturally. "The thorns aren't cruel," she told visitors who still admired the thornless roses. "They're wisdom. They're the rose's way of teaching appropriate relationships. Approach with care. Take only what's offered. Respect the boundary between appreciation and consumption. The thornless rose can't teach this lesson, so it gets consumed." She stopped propagating the thornless mutation and let those plants live out their natural lifespan while caring for them extra carefully. When they eventually died, she didn't replace them. Her garden returned to thorny roses that could protect themselves, that invited careful appreciation rather than careless grabbing. Tonight, you might consider your own thorns, the boundaries you felt guilty about, the protections you've thought were unfriendly or unkind, the ways you've learned to say no, to keep an appropriate distance, to require others to approach you with care rather than carelessness. These aren't flaws, they're wisdom. They're what allow you to survive and thrive. Don't apologize for your thorns. They're part of your design, protecting what's most beautiful about you from being carelessly destroyed. In a valley between two mountain ranges, there was a river that confused everyone who saw it. Most rivers in the region flowed from high elevations to low, following gravity as rivers should. But this river appeared to run uphill, flowing from what looked like lower ground to higher ground, defying logic and nature. The villagers argued about the river for generations. Some said it was cursed, that supernatural forces made it run backwards. Others insisted it was an optical illusion, that the river only appeared to run uphill but actually didn't. A few claimed the river was evidence of magic in the world, proof that natural laws could be suspended. A scholar named Fumiko came to study the peculiar river. She was a woman who trusted observation over superstition, who believed that understanding came from careful study rather than easy assumptions. She spent weeks walking the river's length, taking measurements, making careful notes. What she discovered was unexpected. The river wasn't running uphill at all, though it certainly appeared to be. The optical illusion was created by the unusual topology of the valley. The way surrounding hills created a visual context that made lower ground appear higher and higher ground appear lower. When you adjusted for this visual distortion and looked at actual elevations, the river was flowing downhill as it should, following gravity perfectly. But there was a second discovery, more interesting than the first. There was a short section where the river actually did flow uphill, pushed by an underground spring with such force that it created a brief reversal of normal flow before gravity took over again. This wasn't magic or curse, it was hydrology, underground pressure overcoming gravity temporarily, a natural phenomenon that looked miraculous only because people didn't understand the forces involved. Fumiko shared her findings with the villagers, explaining the optical illusion and the underground spring. Some villagers were relieved to have the mystery explained. Others were disappointed. They had preferred the magical explanation to the scientific one. But an old farmer named Gonji said something that made Fumiko reconsider what she thought she'd discovered. "The river teaches something important," Gonji said. "It teaches that things can look completely wrong while being completely right. That what appears to violate natural laws might just be responding to forces we don't understand yet." He pointed to his fields. "I plant crops that other farmers say won't grow in this soil. They say I'm working against nature, that I should plant what everyone plants. But I've learned that this soil has properties they don't understand. That what looks like wrong farming is actually right farming for these specific conditions. Fumiko thought about this. She had explained the river's apparent backwards flow, but Gonji was suggesting something deeper, that the river taught people to question their assumptions about what's natural, what's possible, what's right. The river looked wrong, but was responding perfectly to actual conditions, both the optical conditions that made flow appear backwards, and the geological conditions that briefly pushed water uphill. You're saying the river teaches us to look deeper before judging, Fumiko asked. More than that, Gonji replied. It teaches us that backwards and forwards depend on what forces you're aware of. To someone who only knows gravity, water flowing uphill is impossible, wrong, against nature. But to someone who understands underground pressure, water flowing uphill is perfectly natural, a correct response to present forces. He gestured to the river. How many things in life look wrong because we're only seeing some of the forces involved? How many people are judged for going against the flow when they're actually responding to forces others can't see? Over the following months, Fumiko expanded her study. She began collecting stories of things that appeared to violate natural expectations, but actually didn't. They just responded to forces that weren't immediately obvious. A tree growing bent at a strange angle because of prevailing winds that had since died down. A flower blooming in winter because of an underground hot spring. A bird flying inland before storms because it sensed pressure changes humans couldn't detect. Each example taught the same lesson. What appears wrong might be responding perfectly to reality, while what appears right might be ignorant of important forces. A young mother came to Fumiko with a problem. My son won't follow the path I've set for him. He's going backwards from where he should go, against everything natural and right. How do I make him flow the right direction? Tell me about your son, Fumiko said. The mother described a boy who refused to take over the family business, who wanted instead to become a traveling musician. It's backwards, she insisted. Children should continue family work. That's the natural flow. He's going against nature. Or he's responding to forces you're not seeing, Fumiko suggested gently. Is he talented musically? Very, but that's not the point. Talent doesn't change duty. Doesn't it? Fumiko asked. The river appears to flow backwards because of forces beneath the surface. Perhaps your son is flowing in a direction that looks backwards to you, but is actually responding to forces inside him, talents, passions, purposes that you can't see or don't value. Just because his flow doesn't match your expectations doesn't mean it's wrong. She told the mother about the river, about how it appeared to defy nature, but actually followed it perfectly when all forces were considered. Your son might be like that river. What looks like backwards rebellion might be forward movement towards something he's meant to do. The question isn't whether he's flowing the way you expected, but whether he's flowing true to himself. This conversation troubled the mother, but she began to observe her son differently. She noticed how music seemed to flow from him naturally, how he came alive when playing, how his path, though different from hers, had its own rightness to it. Eventually, though it was difficult, she accepted that his backwards path might be his right path. Word spread about Fumiko's teachings about the backwards river. People began using it as a way to reconsider their own judgments. When someone's path looked wrong, they would ask, "Am I seeing all the forces involved? Or am I judging based on incomplete understanding?" A magistrate applied this thinking to a legal case. A man had broken a law, but when the magistrate investigated deeper, he found forces that explained the law breaking in a way that changed the judgment entirely. The man wasn't defying order. He was responding to a greater order that the law itself hadn't anticipated. A teacher applied it to a student who learned differently from others. Instead of judging the student as backwards or wrong, the teacher looked for the forces, the different cognitive patterns, the unique intelligences that made the student's apparently backwards approach actually forward for him. Years later, Fumiko's study of the backwards river had become famous beyond the valley. She was invited to give lectures, to advise rulers, to teach scholars. But she always returned to the river itself, watching its apparently impossible flow, using it to remind herself that understanding requires humility, that what appears wrong might be right in ways she hasn't yet grasped. A visiting philosopher asked her, "But aren't some things actually wrong? Doesn't your river teaching lead to excusing everything, to saying nothing is really backwards because we just don't understand the forces?" "No," Fumiko replied carefully. "Some things are genuinely wrong. They're responding to destructive forces like cruelty or ignorance or selfishness. The river teaches discernment, not relativism. It teaches us to look for forces we might not see before judging, but after looking, we still make judgments. The difference is, our judgments are informed by deeper understanding rather than surface appearance." She pointed to the river. "This river looks backwards, but isn't. But if a farmer tried to make his irrigation flow uphill without underground spring pressure, that would be genuinely backwards, genuinely wrong. The teaching isn't that everything is right. The teaching is that apparent wrongness requires investigation before judgment. Some backwards flows are responding to forces we need to understand. Others are just backwards." Tonight, as you rest, you might reconsider things in your life that appear backwards or wrong. Your own path that doesn't match expectations. Other people's choices that confuse you. Circumstances that seem to violate how things should be. Before judging these as wrong, ask, what forces might I not be seeing? What underground pressures might be pushing flow in directions that look impossible, but are actually perfectly natural? The backwards river teaches humility in judgment, curiosity before conclusion, openness to forces you don't yet understand. Not everything that looks wrong is right, but some things that look wrong are responding to reality more accurately than things that look right. The only way to know is to look deeper, to consider forces beyond the obvious, to remain humble about the limits of your understanding. Rest now in acceptance of apparent backwards flows in yourself and others. Let the river run its course, responding to all the forces acting on it, both visible and hidden. Trust that what looks impossible might be possible, that what seems backwards might be forward, that nature is wiser than our quick judgments about what's natural. The river knows where it's going, even when it appears to go the wrong way. With each step on the Zen path, a new lesson unfolds. Now we turn to a story about recognition, of self, of others, and of what truly matters. Listen carefully to the next story. In a bustling market town, there were two merchants who sold rice side by side. One was named Kenji, the other Taro. Both had successful businesses. Both were known throughout the region. But their approaches to business could not have been more different. Kenji used scales that he had carefully adjusted to weigh slightly in his favor. Not much, just enough that most customers wouldn't notice. Over the course of a year, this small deception added significantly to his profits. He told himself everyone did it, that it was just smart business, that customers expected to be cheated a little and factored it into their calculations. Taro, on the other hand, used scales that were calibrated perfectly. He would even add a bit extra to each purchase, telling customers, better to give too much than too little. His profits were smaller than Kenji's, but his conscience was clear. Kenji would mock Taro privately. "You're a fool," he would say. "You could be making so much more. The customers don't know the difference. Why cheat yourself?" "I'm not cheating myself," Taro would reply. "I'm paying myself in peace of mind. Every transaction I make, I know I've been honest. That's worth more to me than extra profit." "Peace of mind doesn't feed your family," Kenji scoffed. "Money feeds your family." For years this continued. Kenji's business appeared more successful. He had a larger house, finer clothes, and more luxuries. Taro lived modestly, comfortable, but not wealthy. To outside observers, Kenji's approach seemed vindicated. Then one day, a wealthy lord came to the market to purchase rice for his household. He was known for being meticulous and for testing merchants' honesty. He had brought his own perfectly calibrated scales. He went first to Kenji's stall and purchased a measure of rice. Then he weighed it on his own scales. The shortage was immediately apparent. "Your scales are dishonest," the lord said coldly. Kenji's face went white. "My lord, there must be some mistake." "Perhaps your scales are inaccurate." "My scales are tested regularly by the Imperial Standards Office," the lord replied. "Yours are deliberately fraudulent. Not only will I not purchase from you, but I will ensure that everyone in my household and in my social circle knows of your dishonesty." The lord then went to Taro's stall and made the same purchase. When he weighed it on his own scales, he found that Taro had actually given more than the agreed upon amount. "Your scales are generous," the lord said with approval. "I prefer to err on the side of giving too much," Taro replied simply. "Then you have earned my business and my recommendation," the lord said. "From now on, all the rice for my household will be purchased from you, and I will tell others of your integrity." Within weeks, Taro's business had doubled, then tripled. The lord's recommendation brought customers from the wealthiest families in the region. Meanwhile, Kenji's business collapsed. Once word spread about his dishonest scales, even his regular customers stopped coming. His reputation destroyed, he eventually had to close his stall. Years later, Kenji came to Taro, humbled and seeking work. "I was wrong," he admitted. "I thought honesty was expensive, but dishonesty cost me everything." Taro hired him, but on one condition, that Kenji help maintain the scales, calibrating them regularly to ensure perfect accuracy. "You need to rebuild your relationship with honesty," Taro said. "Start here, with these scales. Every time you calibrate them, Remember that integrity isn't about what others can see. It's about what you know about yourself. As Kenji worked with the honest scales day after day, something shifted in him. He had spent so many years cheating in small ways that he had forgotten what it felt like to be completely honest. The dishonesty had eaten at him in ways he hadn't even recognized, creating a constant low-level anxiety about being discovered, a subtle shame he carried everywhere. Now, working with honest scales, treating every customer fairly, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Simple peace. No anxiety about being caught. No shame about his methods. No exhausting mental calculations about how much he could get away with. One day, a customer accidentally gave him too much money. The old Kenji would have pocketed it without comment. But now, without even thinking, he called the customer back and returned the extra coins. "You've changed," Taro observed, watching this exchange. "I'm remembering who I was before I started cheating," Kenji replied. "I forgot that honesty feels good, that it's actually easier than dishonesty because you don't have to remember your lies or worry about being discovered. I thought I was taking a shortcut to success, but I was actually taking a shortcut to misery." He looked at the scales, perfectly balanced. "These scales are the most honest thing in this market. They don't calculate or scheme or try to get away with anything. They just measure truly. I spent years being more clever than these scales and less wise." Taro nodded. The scales teach a simple lesson. Integrity is its own reward. Not because good things always happen to honest people, but because living with integrity creates internal peace that no amount of profit gained through dishonesty can match. You sleep better. You walk lighter. You meet people's eyes without flinching. These things have value that can't be measured in coins. A young merchant who was just starting came to Taro for advice. "Everyone says I should adjust my scales just a little, that it's how business is done. But it feels wrong. What should I do?" Taro had Kenji answer. "I spent 20 years cheating," Kenji said, "and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to restore the character I damaged in myself. The extra profit wasn't worth it, not even close. Your scales are a mirror of your character. Keep them honest, and you keep yourself honest. Cheat them, and you cheat yourself in ways that matter far more than money." The young merchant looked at Kenji with curiosity. "But didn't you make more money by cheating?" "For a while," Kenji admitted. "But I lost it all when my dishonesty was discovered. More importantly, I lost something that took much longer to rebuild. My ability to respect myself. Every time I looked in a mirror, I saw a cheat. Every time I counted my profits, I knew they were partly stolen. Every interaction with customers involved acting, pretending, and hiding what I really was. It was exhausting and corrosive." He gestured to the perfectly balanced scales. "These scales are at peace. They have nothing to hide, nothing to defend, nothing to remember or cover up. They just are what they are. That's what integrity gives you. The peace of being what you are without pretense or deception. It's the most valuable thing I've learned, and I learned it the hard way." Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own scales. Where in your life are you adjusting the balance, even slightly in your own favor? Where are you being less than completely honest, with others or with yourself? These small dishonesties might seem insignificant, but they accumulate. They create a background noise of anxiety and shame that you carry everywhere. What would it feel like to calibrate your scales perfectly? To be completely honest, even when no one is watching, even when you could get away with a small deception. Not because of fear of being caught, but because integrity itself is the reward. Because living with honest scales creates an internal peace that no amount of clever advantage taking can provide. Rest tonight in honesty. Let go of all the small ways you've been adjusting the scales. Let go of the exhausting mental work of maintaining deceptions. Be like the perfectly balanced scale, true, honest, at peace with what you are. The reward isn't somewhere in the future. The reward is the immediate relief of no longer having to hide, to calculate, to worry about being discovered. Honest scales don't lie awake at night. Neither do honest hearts. There was a water bearer in a mountain village who carried water from the stream to the town each day. She used a wooden pole across her shoulders with a large pot hanging from each end. One pot was perfect, without flaw, and always delivered a full portion of water at journey's end. The other pot had a crack running down one side, and by the time the water bearer reached town, it was only half full. This went on for 2 years. The perfect pot was proud of its accomplishment, delivering full measures each day, fulfilling the purpose for which it was made. The cracked pot was ashamed of its imperfection, distressed that it could only do half of what it was meant to do. Finally, the cracked pot spoke to the water bearer one morning by the stream. "I am ashamed of myself. I apologize to you." "Why?" asked the water bearer. "What are you ashamed of?" "For 2 years, I have been able to deliver only half my load because this crack in my side causes water to leak out all the way back to town. Because of my flaw, you have to do more work and you don't get full value for your efforts." The water bearer smiled kindly. "As we return to town today, I want you to notice the flowers along the path." As they walked up the hill from the stream, the cracked pot did notice the beautiful wildflowers growing along one side of the path. This cheered it somewhat, but at the end of the trail it still felt bad because it had leaked out half its water again. The water bearer said to the pot, "Did you notice that there were flowers only on your side of the path, but not on the other pot's side? That's because I've always known about your crack and I took advantage of it. I planted flower seeds on your side of the path, and every day while we've walked back, you've watered them. For 2 years, I have been able to pick these beautiful flowers to decorate my home and to sell at market. Without you being just the way you are, I would not have this beauty to grace my life." The cracked pot was silent, absorbing this revelation. What it had thought was its greatest weakness had been serving a purpose all along. The crack that made it imperfect for one purpose made it perfect for another purpose it never knew existed. A student who heard this story asked the local Zen teacher, "But wouldn't it have been better if the pot had no crack? Then the water bearer would have had twice as much water and could have watered the flowers separately." The teacher smiled. "You're thinking of efficiency. The story is teaching about purpose. The cracked pot thought its only purpose was to carry water to town. It judged itself a failure at this purpose. But it was also watering flowers, creating beauty, serving a function it never imagined. What appears to be failure at one purpose maybe success at a different purpose we don't yet recognize. The teacher continued, "Most of us are like the cracked pot. We have flaws, weaknesses, places where we leak, ways we don't measure up to our idea of what we should be. We judge ourselves harshly for these cracks. But often, these very flaws are serving purposes we cannot see. The things we think make us inadequate may be making us exactly adequate for something we don't yet understand." A woman in the village heard this teaching and thought about her own life. She had always been too sensitive, too easily moved to tears, too affected by others' suffering. In a society that valued stoicism and emotional control, she felt defective. She tried to toughen up, to be stronger, to not leak emotions everywhere she went. But then she noticed something. The very sensitivity she judged as weakness made her extraordinarily good at caring for those who were ill or grieving. People who were suffering would seek her out because her emotional openness created a safe space for their own grief. Her tears gave others permission to cry. Her tender heart helped heal other tender hearts. She was a cracked pot, yes, leaking emotional responses all along the path. But in her wake, flowers of compassion and healing grew. What she had thought was her failure was actually serving a purpose she had never imagined. A man in the village had a different crack. He couldn't focus on one thing for long. His mind would jump from interest to interest, never specializing, never becoming an expert in anything. In a society that valued mastery and deep expertise, he felt scattered and inadequate. But then he recognized what his crack had created. Because he knew a little about many things, he could connect ideas across different fields. He could see patterns that specialists missed. He could translate between different domains of knowledge, creating bridges where others saw only walls. The very quality he had judged as inability to focus was actually ability to see relationships. His crack was watering flowers he had never noticed. The teacher who told the story of the cracked pot would say, "Before you try to fix yourself, before you work so hard to seal up all your cracks, pause. Ask yourself, what is this crack watering? Where are flowers growing because of my imperfections? What purposes might I be serving that I haven't recognized because I'm so busy judging myself as broken?" This doesn't mean we shouldn't work on genuine problems or grow beyond destructive patterns, but it means we should look carefully at what we think are flaws. Sometimes what appears to be a weakness is actually a strength in disguise. Sometimes what we're failing at in one area, we're succeeding at in another area we haven't valued or noticed. The perfect pot in the story delivered water reliably, but it created no beauty. It fulfilled its intended function, but nothing more. The cracked pot, by failing at perfect water delivery, succeeded at something the perfect pot could never do. It made flowers grow. Tonight, as you rest, you might think about your own cracks, the ways you leak, the places you feel inadequate or broken. Instead of judging these cracks harshly, you might ask, what flowers might these cracks be watering? What beauty might be growing along the path of my imperfection? You are not meant to be a perfect vessel that holds everything in. You are meant to be authentically yourself, cracks and all. And those cracks, those places where you leak, those ways you fail to be perfect, they might be creating more beauty in the world than you realize. Rest now in acceptance of your cracked nature. You don't need to be sealed up and perfect. You're serving purposes you don't even know about, watering flowers you can't see, creating beauty through the very imperfections you judge so harshly. You are enough, cracks and all. More than enough. You are exactly what the world needs you to be. As our exploration of Zen Buddhism deepens, let us listen to a story that reveals how true worth is often overlooked. Here starts the next story. In a monastery where monks practiced intensive meditation, there was a monk named Genzo, who struggled more than any of the others. While his fellow monks seemed to make progress, reporting experiences of insight and clarity, Genzo felt nothing but confusion and exhaustion. He tried so hard. He would sit in meditation until his legs ached and his back screamed. He would concentrate fiercely, trying to force his mind into the states he read about in the sutras. He would stay up late studying, trying to understand intellectually what he couldn't grasp experientially. But nothing seemed to work. While others reported breakthrough moments, sudden insights, and powerful experiences during meditation, Genzo just felt tired. So tired that he would sometimes fall asleep during meditation sessions, which filled him with shame. The other monks were achieving enlightenment, and he couldn't even stay awake. The monastery's teacher, Master Dogen, watched Genzo's struggle with patient concern. He saw how the young monk was wearing himself out, how the desperate striving was actually creating obstacles rather than removing them. One day, after Genzo had fallen asleep during meditation yet again and woken up mortified, Dogen called him aside. "Genzo, you look exhausted. When did you last sleep a full night?" "I can't afford to sleep, Master. I'm so far behind the others. I need to practice more, not less." "Go to your room and sleep," Dogen said gently. "That's not a suggestion. It's an instruction. Sleep for as long as your body needs." Genzo was confused but obedient. He went to his room, lay down, and immediately fell into the deepest sleep he'd had in months. He slept through the afternoon, through the evening meditation, through the night, and into the next morning. When he finally woke, something was different. He couldn't name what had changed, but the world looked somehow clearer. The desperate striving that had consumed him was just gone. He felt a quietness inside that he'd never experienced before. He went to find Dogen, unsure what to say about this strange shift. "Master, something happened while I slept, but I don't know what. I feel different, but I didn't have any dramatic experience, any sudden insight. I just slept." Dogen smiled. "And in that sleep, you let go of trying. You let go of the desperate effort to achieve enlightenment. You stopped fighting with yourself. And in that letting go, what was always there became apparent." "But I didn't do anything," Genzo protested. "I just slept." "The others have profound experiences during meditation. I fell asleep." "Enlightenment isn't always dramatic," Dogen explained. "Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it comes not through effort, but through the cessation of effort. You've been trying so hard to wake up that you couldn't see you were already awake. You needed to sleep, to let go, to stop trying, for what's always been true to become obvious." Over the following days, Genzo noticed that the peace hadn't left him. It wasn't a dramatic altered state. It was more like a background quietness, a sense of okayness that didn't depend on circumstances. The desperate seeking was gone, not because he had found what he was looking for, but because he had realized he'd never lost it. Other monks asked him what had happened. "Did you have a breakthrough? A sudden awakening?" "I don't know," Genzo replied honestly. "I just slept. And when I woke up, something had shifted. But it wasn't like lightning striking. It was more like clouds clearing and realizing the sky had been there all along." Master Dogen used Genzo's experience to teach others. Many of you are waiting for dramatic enlightenment experiences. Thunder and lightning, profound insights, altered states. But enlightenment is often more subtle than that. It's the quiet recognition of what's always been true. It's the simple shift from trying to be at peace to noticing the peace that's already here. Years later, when Genzo told his story to students, he would laugh at his younger self. "I was trying so hard to wake up that I exhausted myself. I thought enlightenment was something to achieve through effort. But sometimes you have to stop trying to wake up and just let yourself sleep. Sometimes awakening comes through the door you're not watching." Tonight, stop trying so hard. Stop striving for perfect meditation or ideal relaxation or correct rest. Stop watching for enlightenment or breakthroughs or special experiences. Just sleep. Just let go. Just be tired and allow yourself rest without judgment. What you're seeking might come not through your effort, but through your willingness to stop efforting and simply be. Sleep through your own awakening if you must. It will be there when you wake. In a village rebuilding after a great earthquake, there was a master mason named Takeo who was known throughout the region for building walls that followed precise specifications. Every stone placed according to traditional methods, every measurement exact, every joint perfect. His walls were architectural achievements, admired by other masons and praised in the capital. When the earthquake struck and buildings collapsed throughout the region, everyone expected Takeo's walls to stand as a testament to proper craftsmanship. Instead, most of his carefully built walls fell. The perfect joints fractured. The precisely placed stones tumbled. All that meticulous work reduced to rubble. But there was one wall that remained standing, and it puzzled everyone. It was a wall that Takeo's apprentice, a young man named Jiro, had built in the early days of his training. The wall wasn't straight. It curved and bent in unusual ways. The stones weren't uniform or perfectly fitted. By every standard of proper masonry, the wall was wrong. Takeo had been embarrassed by it, had planned to tear it down and rebuild it properly, but had never gotten around to it. Now that the crooked, imperfect wall stood while all of Takeo's masterpieces lay in ruins. After the earthquake, people would visit that wall, marveling at how something so improperly built had survived when everything correct had fallen. Takeo was humbled and confused. He went to examine the crooked wall carefully, trying to understand what accidental wisdom it contained. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he knew about his craft. The wall's curves and bends, which he had seen as flaws, had actually allowed it to flex during the earthquake, rather than rigidly resisting the force. The imperfect joints had given the structure some ability to shift without completely fracturing. The irregular stones had created a kind of organic stability that precise, uniform stones couldn't achieve. "I built this wall wrong," Jiro said when he and Takeo examined it together. "I was new. I didn't know the proper methods yet. I just placed stones in ways that felt stable. You built it intuitively, Takeo replied slowly, while I built with rigid adherence to rules. Your intuition understood something about forces and flexibility that the traditional methods don't account for. The rules made sense for normal conditions, but they weren't designed for extreme stress. Your ignorance of the rules allowed you to respond to the actual needs of the situation. An engineer from the capital came to study the surviving wall. He measured its curves, examined its composition, and tried to understand its principles. This wall shouldn't have stood, he said finally. By every calculation, every principle of proper construction, it should have fallen. But clearly, our principles are incomplete. This wall knows something we don't. Takeo spent months studying not just Jiro's wall, but other structures that had survived. He found a pattern. The buildings that stood weren't always the ones built most correctly. Often, they were the ones with irregular features, with imperfections that accidentally created flexibility. The traditional methods, designed over centuries for stable conditions, weren't necessarily best for extreme conditions. He began incorporating these insights into his new work. He still used traditional methods as a foundation, but he added intentional irregularities, curves instead of straight lines, flexible joints instead of rigid joints of rigid ones, and organic shapes instead of perfect geometry. Other masons criticized him. "You're violating the principles," they said. "You're building incorrectly." "I'm building for survival rather than for appearance," Takeo replied. The old principles were based on aesthetic ideals and normal conditions. "I'm building for abnormal conditions based on what actually survived when everything else fell." His new walls looked less impressive than his old ones. They weren't as straight, as precise, as aesthetically pleasing. But when another earthquake struck years later, these walls stood. The traditional walls, built by masons who still adhered to the old, correct methods, fell again. Takeo's irregular, imperfect walls flexed and bent and survived. "What's more important?" Takeo asked his critics. "Building correctly according to traditional standards, or building what actually works?" "My old walls were perfect and dead. My new walls are imperfect and alive." He trained a new generation of masons in what he called flexible building. They learned the traditional methods, but also learned when to deviate from them, when to trust intuition over rules, and when to value survival over correctness. "The crooked wall saved my life," Takeo would tell students. Not just physically, by remaining standing during the earthquake, but professionally and spiritually, by taught me that correctness isn't the same as truth. Something can be done exactly right according to established principles and still fail when conditions change. And something can be done wrong and still succeed because it responds to actual conditions rather than theoretical ideals. One student asked, "So should we ignore all the traditional methods?" "No," Takeo replied. "Learn them, understand them, but don't worship them. Rules are tools, not truths. They work until they don't. The crooked wall taught me to pay attention to what actually works, rather than what should work according to theory. Sometimes the imperfect, the irregular, the supposedly wrong thing contains wisdom that perfection misses." He would take students to see Jiro's wall, still standing decades after the earthquake that revealed its value. "This wall is a better teacher than any master mason," he would say. It teaches that survival often comes from flexibility rather than rigidity, from imperfection that allows adaptation rather than perfection that allows no variation. It teaches that what's wrong by one standard might be right by a more important standard. The wall became something of a shrine. People would visit it, touch it, and remember that sometimes what appears to be failure or imperfection is actually hidden success. That correctness and effectiveness aren't always the same thing. That rules have limits, and intuition has wisdom. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider the crooked walls in your life, the things you've done imperfectly, irregularly, against the rules or proper methods. Perhaps these apparent flaws are actually what allowed you to survive when others who did everything correctly fell apart. Perhaps your imperfections are flexibilities that rigid perfection lacks. You don't have to do everything correctly. You don't have to follow every rule or meet every standard. Sometimes the crooked wall stands when the straight wall falls. Sometimes your irregular, imperfect, supposedly wrong way of doing things is actually what works best for the conditions you're actually in, rather than the ideal conditions that rules assume. Rest now in acceptance of your crooked walls. They may not look perfect. They may not meet conventional standards, but they've kept you standing when straight walls would have crumbled. Your imperfections aren't failures. They're flexible, and flexibility is what allows survival when everything rigid breaks. The crooked wall knows this. Now you know it too. Continuing along the path of Zen insight, we pause now to hear a teaching about perception and hidden value. Listen carefully to the next story. In a village where everyone prided themselves on their sophistication and education, there lived a simple man named Saburo who worked as a night watchman. His job was to walk through the streets after dark, making sure all was well, that no fires had started, that no trouble was brewing. Saburo had little education. He couldn't read the classical texts that the village scholars discussed. He didn't understand philosophy or poetry. The educated people of the village looked down on him somewhat, considering him simple, perhaps even slow-witted. But Saburo had one practice that brought him deep joy. On his nightly rounds, whenever he found a puddle that reflected the moon, he would stop and gaze at it. He would crouch down beside these puddles and smile at the perfect circle of light floating in the water, no matter how small or muddy the puddle was. One night, a scholar named Masato was walking home late from a dinner party where there had been much wine and intellectual discussion. He came upon Saburo crouching beside a small puddle, staring into it with a look of wonder. "Saburo!" Masato called out, his words slightly slurred. "What are you doing down there in the mud?" "Looking at the moon," Saburo replied, not taking his eyes from the puddle. Masato laughed. "That's not the moon, you fool. That's just a reflection. The real moon is up there." He pointed to the sky, where the full moon hung bright and distant. "I know," Saburo said simply, "but I can't touch the real moon. It's too far away. This moon in the puddle, I can see it up close. I can watch it shimmer when the wind blows. I can see clouds pass across it. It's right here with me." "But it's not real," Masato insisted. "It's just an image, a copy. Why waste time looking at a reflection when you could look at the actual moon?" Saburo finally looked up at Masato. I look at both. The moon in the sky is beautiful, but the moon in the puddle is beautiful too. And this one, I can be close to. This one shares the street with me. Why should I ignore it just because it's a reflection? Masato shook his head and walked away, chuckling at the simple watchman's foolishness. But a traveling Zen monk had overheard this exchange. He approached Saburo and sat down beside the puddle. "May I look at the moon with you?" the monk asked. Saburo smiled and moved over to make room. Together, they gazed at the reflection in the puddle. After a while, the monk said, "That scholar thinks you're simple. He thinks you don't understand the difference between the real moon and its reflection." "I understand the difference," Saburo said quietly. "I just don't think it matters as much as he does." "Tell me what you mean," the monk said. Saburo thought for a moment, then spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. "The scholar says the moon in the puddle isn't real. But I'm seeing it right now. It's making light in the water. It's changing as I watch it. How is that not real? Maybe it's not the same as the moon in the sky, but it's not nothing. It's something. And that something brings me joy." The monk nodded, saying nothing, encouraging Saburo to continue. People like Masato think some experiences are real and important, and other experiences are just reflections, just copies, not worth their time. But I don't see it that way. When I see beauty in a puddle, I'm really seeing it. When I feel peace looking at the moon's reflection, I'm really feeling it. Just because it's a reflection doesn't make my experience less real. The monk smiled broadly. "You understand something that the scholar doesn't. He's so concerned with distinguishing between original and copy, between real and reflected, that he misses the truth. All experience is real experience, even if it's experience of a reflection. The joy you feel looking at this puddle moon is not reflected. It's actual joy." They sat together in silence for a while longer. Then the monk said, "There's a teaching in Zen about the moon and its reflection. It says that trying to grasp the absolute truth is like trying to grab the moon in the sky. But seeing truth in everyday life is like seeing the moon reflected in water. We can't touch the infinite directly, but we experience it through its reflections in ordinary moments. You've understood this naturally, without studying." Saburo looked puzzled. "I don't know about truth or the infinite. I just like looking at the moon in puddles." "That's exactly what I mean," the monk laughed. "The scholar knows many teachings but understands little. You know no teachings but understand much." Word of this conversation spread through the village. Some people thought it was just another example of Saburo's simplicity being mistaken for wisdom. But others began to think differently about reflections. A woman who had been dismissing her own life as less important than the lives of famous people she read about, realized that her experience of love, loss, joy, and sorrow was not a lesser version of human experience. It was human experience itself. The fact that no one wrote books about her life didn't make her life less real. A man who had been ashamed of his humble work, comparing it constantly to the prestigious careers of others, recognized that his satisfaction in work well done was not a reflected satisfaction. It was real satisfaction. no less valuable for coming from ordinary labor than satisfaction from celebrated achievement. A child who loved to draw but was told her art was just copying the real world, understood suddenly that her experience of creating was real creating, even if she was working from life rather than pure imagination. The monk stayed in the village for several weeks, and people noticed that he would often walk with Saburo on his night rounds. They would stop at puddles together, looking at reflections of the moon, stars, and lantern light. The educated people found this baffling. Why would a learned monk waste time with a simple watchman looking at puddles? But others began to join them. At first, just one or two, then more. They would walk the night streets, stopping at puddles, looking at reflected light, experiencing the strange beauty of seeing the distant brought near, the vast captured in the small. One night, Masato the scholar, humbled by wine, or perhaps by something else, joined the group. He crouched beside a puddle and looked at the moon's reflection. At first, all he could think was, "This isn't the real moon." But gradually, as he watched, something shifted. He stopped comparing the reflection to the original and simply experienced what was before him. Light in water, movement and shimmer, beauty is accessible and close. He found, to his surprise, that he was moved, not by the moon itself, which he had seen countless times, but by this moment of looking at light in a puddle, surrounded by others who were also looking, all of them sharing this simple, real experience. "I understand now," he said quietly to Saburo. "I've been so busy distinguishing between real and reflected that I forgot that all of it is real. The moon in the sky is real. The moon in the puddle is real. And my experience of looking at either one is real. Nothing is lesser just because it's a reflection." Saburo smiled. "The puddle moon is closer. I like that about it." Years later, when travelers asked what was special about this village, people would tell them about the night walks, the puddle gazing, the practice of seeing reflections not as inferior copies, but as real encounters with beauty brought near. And they would tell them about Saburo, the watchman who taught a village full of educated people, that reflection is not the opposite of reality. Reflection is reality in another form. Experience is experience, whether of original or copy, source or reflection. The joy is real. The beauty is real. The moment is real. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what experiences you've been dismissing as just reflections. What joys have you minimized because they weren't the real thing? What beauty have you ignored because it came to you secondhand, through a screen, through a retelling, through some medium other than direct contact? All experience is real experience. The peace you feel listening to these words is not reflected peace, it's actual peace. The rest you're settling into is not a copy of rest, it's real rest. You don't have to touch the moon directly to experience moonlight. You don't have to live someone else's life to experience real life. Your experience right now, reflection or not, is completely real. Rest in the truth that this moment, this breath, this experience of being here is not practice for the real thing. It is the real thing. Nothing is lacking. Nothing needs to be more direct or more authentic. This is it. In this reflection, you call your life your actual life. These reflections, you call your experiences, are your actual experiences. And they are enough, more than enough. They are real. In a monastery famous for its scholarly debates and philosophical discussions, there arrived a new student named May, who puzzled everyone by her silence. While other students constantly asked questions, challenged teachings, and engaged in elaborate discussions about Buddhist philosophy, May simply listened, nodded, and returned to her meditation. The other students found this frustrating. They were proud of their intellectual engagement, their ability to analyze complex concepts, and their sophisticated questions. May's silence seemed like a criticism of their approach, or worse, like she wasn't intelligent enough to participate. One day, after a particularly intense discussion about the nature of emptiness, a senior student named Takeo approached May. "You never ask questions," he said. "Don't you have doubts? Don't you want to understand these teachings more deeply?" May looked at him with clear, calm eyes. "I understand enough to practice," she said simply. "But there's so much complexity, so many layers of meaning. How can you not have questions?" "I have one question," May replied. "Am I suffering less? If my practice reduces suffering, then I'm understanding. If not, then no amount of questions and answers will help." Takeo was taken aback. He realized that despite all his questions and discussions, despite his vast accumulation of knowledge about Buddhist philosophy, he was just as anxious, just as unsettled as when he had arrived at the monastery. He knew more, certainly, but he suffered no less. The monastery's abbot, Master Gensho, had been observing May quietly. Unlike the other students who sought her out for teaching constantly, May seemed to learn by watching, by practicing, by experiencing directly, rather than by asking for explanations. One afternoon, Master Gensho was working in the garden when May came to help him. They worked together in silence for an hour, pulling weeds, tending plants. Finally, Gensho spoke. "You don't ask questions like the others. Why?" May continued her work for a moment before responding. "When I'm thirsty, I drink water. I don't ask about the chemistry of H2O or debate the philosophical implications of thirst. The direct experience of drinking satisfies thirst in a way that talking about water never could." She pulled another weed carefully, examining its roots before setting it aside. The other students have many questions about enlightenment, about emptiness, about the nature of mind. But they could discuss these things forever and never experience what the words point toward. I'd rather practice one moment with full attention than discuss 1,000 concepts about practice. Gensho smiled. "You understand something they haven't yet learned. The teachings are like a finger pointing at the moon. Most people study the finger endlessly, analyzing it, asking questions about it, debating its exact position. But you're looking where the finger points." May nodded. "I watch you," she said simply. "The way you move through the garden with full attention. The way you respond to people with presence rather than scripted wisdom. The way you sit in meditation without strain or performance. These teach me more than any discussion could." "What have you learned by watching?" Gensho asked. "That peace doesn't come from understanding everything intellectually. It comes from being fully present to what is. That wisdom isn't accumulated knowledge but direct seeing. That the questions that seem so important eventually dissolve when you stop feeding them with attention and instead simply practice." She paused in her work, looking at the master directly. The other students ask you hundreds of questions. I have only one. Am I doing the practice correctly? And your answer is in how you nod or don't nod when you see me sitting. That's all I need. Over the following years, something interesting happened. The students who had asked the most questions, who had engaged in the most elaborate discussions, often left the monastery still searching, still unsatisfied, still believing that the answer was in some concept they hadn't yet grasped. But May stayed, and her practice deepened. She didn't become a great scholar or a famous teacher, but people noticed a quality in her presence, a settledness that comes from direct understanding rather than intellectual knowledge. When Master Gensho became too old to teach, he surprised everyone by naming May as his successor. The scholarly students were bewildered. She had never demonstrated vast knowledge or sophisticated understanding. She had barely spoken in all her years at the monastery. At the ceremony, one bold student asked, "Master May, you never asked questions like we did. You never engaged in the discussions and debates that we thought were so important. Why should you lead us?" May looked at the gathered students with gentle eyes. "You learned about Buddhism," she said quietly. "I learned Buddhism. There's a difference." She picked up a cup of water. If you're thirsty, and someone describes water to you in elaborate detail, explains its molecular structure, debates its philosophical significance, are you satisfied, or do you need to drink? She drank from the cup, then set it down. "For years you've been studying descriptions of water while remaining thirsty. I just drank. Not because I'm smarter or better, but because I stopped believing that understanding the description was the same as tasting the reality." She looked around at them all. "You can stay here and continue to ask questions if you wish. Questions are not wrong. Discussion is not wrong. But eventually, you might notice that the mind that asks endless questions is avoiding the practice that would make the questions unnecessary. Eventually, you might discover that some things can only be understood by direct experience, not by intellectual analysis." One student asked, "But how do we know if we're practicing correctly if we don't ask questions?" "Practice and watch what happens," May replied. "Are you kinder? Are you more patient? Are you suffering less? Is there more peace in your heart? These are not things you know by asking questions. These are things you know by looking honestly at your own experience." She stood to leave, then paused. "I'll tell you one more thing I learned by not asking questions. When your mind is quiet, when it's not constantly generating inquiries and debates and analysis, you can hear something deeper. You can hear the teaching that's always present, that doesn't need words, that comes from direct contact with reality itself. That's the teaching I chose to listen to." Tonight, as you rest, you might notice your own questioning mind. How many questions are running through your thoughts? Questions about tomorrow, about your life, about whether you're doing things right, about what it all means. What would happen if you let those questions rest for these hours of sleep? What if, instead of asking and analyzing and trying to figure everything out, you experience this moment directly? You don't need to understand everything to rest. You don't need to have all the answers to be at peace right now. Sometimes the wisest response to life's complexity is not another question, but a quiet presence. Not more analysis, but more direct experiencing. Not more words, but more silence in which to hear what words can never say. Let your questions burn themselves out tonight. Let your seeking mind rest. And in that rest, you might discover what may be discovered. That direct experience often teaches what endless inquiry never can. As we drift deeper into the still waters of Zen, a quiet teaching begins to rise, one that speaks of clarity and of value not always seen. Listen gently now. The next story begins. In the mountains far from any town, there lived a hermit named Ryanan who had retreated from society to live in solitude. He had built a small hut beside a stream and spent his days in meditation, contemplation, and simple living. He sought no company, spoke to no one, desired only silence and solitude. Ryanan had not always been a hermit. For many years, he had lived in the capital city, working as a scholar at a prestigious academy. He had been surrounded by people constantly, engaged in endless conversations, debates, and social obligations. His days were filled with meetings, his evenings with gatherings, his mind always occupied with the opinions and expectations of others. He had been respected in those days, successful by any measure, but he had felt increasingly hollow, as if the constant engagement with others was somehow preventing him from engaging with himself. Every conversation pulled him outward. Every social obligation demanded he present a certain face, play a certain role. He began to feel like a performer in his own life, never quite sure who he was beneath all the performances. So one day, without announcement or explanation, Ryanan left. He walked away from his position, his reputation, his comfortable life, and disappeared into the mountains. He wanted only to be alone, to find in solitude what he had lost in society. For the first year, he lived in complete isolation. He built his hut with his own hands, slowly and carefully, in no particular hurry. He learned to grow simple vegetables. He learned the rhythms of the mountain, the patterns of weather, and the habits of the animals who shared the forest. He sat in meditation for hours each day, not trying to achieve anything, just sitting with the silence. The silence was difficult at first. His mind was so accustomed to constant stimulation that it created its own noise, replaying conversations, imagining scenarios, filling the quiet with internal chatter. But gradually, over months, the internal noise began to settle. Gaps appeared between thoughts. The silence became less empty and more full, filled with the subtle sounds of wind in trees, water over stones, his own breathing. Ryanan found that in this silence, he could hear things he had never heard before. Not voices or supernatural sounds, but deeper truths about himself and about life. Insights would arise naturally, not from thinking or reasoning, but from simply being present. He began to understand things he had studied for years, but never really grasped. The difference between knowledge and wisdom. The difference between being alone and being lonely. The difference between silence and emptiness. But something strange began to happen. The more Ryanan retreated into solitude, the more visitors he attracted. At first, it was just a wandering monk who happened upon his hut and asked for water. Ryanan gave him water, and the monk went on his way. But somehow, word spread. There was a hermit in the mountains, someone who had given up the world, someone who lived in complete simplicity and silence. People began to seek him out. They would make the long journey up the mountain path, arriving at his hut with questions, seeking wisdom, wanting to learn from this man who had withdrawn from society. At first, Ryonen was dismayed. He had come to the mountains precisely to escape people, to be alone. When he saw visitors approaching, he would hide inside his hut, waiting for them to leave. But they wouldn't leave. They would sit outside his door, sometimes for days, patient and persistent. Eventually, Ryonen realized that hiding was pointless. These people had traveled far to see him. The least he could do was acknowledge them. So he began to receive visitors, though reluctantly. He would listen to their questions and offer what responses came to him. He never tried to be wise or profound. He simply spoke from his experience of solitude and silence. The puzzling thing was that the more plainly he spoke, the more wisdom people found in his words. When he'd lived in the city, surrounded by people, busy with social obligations and scholarly debates, no one had sought his wisdom particularly. He had been respected, certainly, but not sought out as a teacher. Now that he had nothing to say and no desire to teach, people traveled great distances to hear from him. One day, he asked a visitor directly, "Why do you come here?" "I was a scholar once, surrounded by books and ideas and other learned people. No one traveled to seek my wisdom then. Now I live in a hut in the mountains. I've read no books in years, and I have no new ideas to offer. Why travel so far to talk to someone who has nothing to give you?" The visitor, a merchant named Taro, who had closed his business for a week to make this journey, thought carefully before answering. "In town," Taro said, "everyone is so busy talking that no one is listening. Everyone has so many ideas, so many opinions, so much they want to say that there's no space for wisdom to emerge. Conversations are just people waiting for their turn to speak, not actually hearing each other. You're different. You have silence. You have space. When you speak, even just a few words, they matter because they come from stillness rather than from the noise of a busy mind." He shifted his position on the ground where they sat. "And there's something else. In the city, I'm surrounded by people, but I feel more alone than you probably do here in your solitude. Everyone wants something from me. They want my money, my influence, my agreement, my approval. Every conversation has an agenda. But you want nothing from me. You didn't ask me to come here. You gain nothing from talking to me. That makes your words trustworthy. I can actually hear them because I'm not wondering what you're trying to get from me." Another visitor, a young woman named Hana, who had been struggling with the question of whether to marry a man her family had chosen, explained her reason for coming. "Everyone in my life has an opinion about what I should do," she said. "My parents think I should marry this man because it's a good match for the family. My friends think I should refuse because I don't love him. Everyone is so certain, so full of advice, so ready to tell me the right answer. But you're the first person who didn't immediately tell me what to do. You just listened. And in that listening, in that space you created, I could finally hear my own wisdom. The answer was in me all along, but I couldn't hear it over everyone else's voices." Ryonen began to understand. It wasn't despite his solitude that people sought him out, but because of it. In his withdrawal from society, he had created something increasingly rare: space, silence, presence unburdened by agenda or expectation. And people were drawn to that the way thirsty travelers are drawn to water in the desert. He noticed something else too. The wisdom people attributed to him wasn't really his wisdom at all. It emerged from the silence he had cultivated. In the stillness of his solitary life, he could hear things that the noise of society drowned out. He could see clearly because his vision wasn't constantly pulled in multiple directions. He could speak truthfully because he had no reputation to protect, no social position to defend, no need to appear wise or knowledgeable. In the city, he had been so concerned with how others perceived him, with maintaining his scholarly reputation, with not saying anything foolish, that his words had been calculated and careful. Now, with no one to impress and nothing to lose, he simply said what was true. And paradoxically, this made his words more valuable. A scholar from the academy where Ryanan had once taught made the journey to see him. The scholar, a man named Masao, who had been Ryanan's colleague, couldn't understand why Ryanan had left such a prestigious position. "You were brilliant," Masao said. "You could have become the head of the academy. You could have written books that would have been studied for generations. Instead, you're here in a hut in the mountains, accomplishing nothing. Don't you feel you've wasted your potential?" Ryanan smiled. "When I was at the academy, I was surrounded by brilliant people, impressive ideas, important work. But I felt empty. I was always performing, always trying to prove something, always concerned with how others judged me and my ideas. Here, I accomplish nothing by the world's standards, but I'm not empty anymore." "But you could have influenced so many people from that position," Masao protested. "I influence more people now," Ryanan replied quietly. "Not through my scholarship or my position, but through my presence. People come here seeking something they can't find in the busy world, and I can offer it to them precisely because I've stepped out of that busy world. If I had stayed at the academy, I would have had a position and a reputation, but I wouldn't have had what these people are seeking." Masao looked uncomfortable. "What exactly are they seeking?" "Space," Ryanan said. "Silence. Someone who will listen without agenda. Someone who isn't trying to convince them of anything or get anything from them. Someone who has stepped out of the endless competition and comparison and striving that fills the world. I couldn't offer that while I was still caught up in it myself." He gestured to the quiet forest around them. "This solitude isn't empty, as you seem to think. It's full of attention, presence, awareness. When you're constantly busy, constantly engaged, constantly consuming information and experience and interaction, there's no space for anything deeper to emerge. You fill your life so completely with activity that wisdom has nowhere to appear. But when you create space, when you embrace solitude even briefly, wisdom has room to arise." Masao stayed for 3 days, and during that time, something shifted in him. The first day, he kept trying to debate and discuss, to engage Ryanan in the kind of intellectual sparring they had done at the academy. But Ryanan wouldn't engage. He would simply sit in silence, or make tea, or suggest they walk in the forest. At first, Masao found this frustrating, but by the second day, he began to notice something. His mind, which was usually so busy with thoughts and arguments and analyses, was beginning to quiet. In the space Ryanan created through his silence, Masao's own deeper thoughts could finally surface. By the third day, Masao understood. "You're teaching me even though you're not saying much of anything," he said. "The teaching is in the space itself, in the silence. I can hear my own wisdom because you're not filling all the space with yours." Ryonan nodded. "At the academy, we competed to be the most impressive speaker, the most brilliant thinker. We filled every silence with words, every space with ideas. But wisdom doesn't emerge from fullness. It emerges from emptiness. The sage isn't the one with the most to say, but the one who creates space for what needs to be heard." Years passed, and Ryanan's hut became something of a pilgrimage site. But he never encouraged this. He never advertised his presence or claimed any special wisdom. He simply continued living as he had been, in solitude and silence, receiving those who came to him but never seeking them out. One day, a young man arrived who reminded Ryanan of himself many years ago. The young man was ambitious, successful, recognized in his field, but he was also hollow, exhausted, playing a role rather than living a life. "Should I give it all up?" the young man asked. "Should I leave society like you did?" Ryonan looked at him carefully. "Why would you do that?" "Because you found peace here. You found wisdom. Maybe I need to become a hermit too." "I didn't find peace because I became a hermit," Ryonan said. "I became a hermit because I needed to find peace and I couldn't find it in the busy world. But the lesson isn't that everyone should flee to the mountains. The lesson is about creating space, cultivating silence, stepping back from constant busyness and engagement. You can do that without leaving society." He poured tea for both of them. Some people need to physically retreat to learn solitude. Others can cultivate it right in the middle of the busy world. The external form matters less than the internal reality. What matters is whether you create space in your life for silence, for reflection, for listening to deeper wisdom. Whether you do that in a hut on a mountain or in a house in a city, the principle is the same. The young man looked disappointed. "So you're not going to tell me to become a hermit?" "I'm going to tell you to become familiar with solitude," Ryonan replied. "To learn to be alone without being lonely. To create spaces in your busy life where you're not consuming, not producing, not performing, just being. Maybe that means taking a walk alone each day. Maybe it means sitting in silence for an hour each morning. Maybe it means turning off all your devices for one day a week and just being present to yourself and to life. The specific form doesn't matter. What matters is that you stop filling every moment with activity and create space for something deeper to emerge." He looked out at the forest. "People come here thinking I have some special wisdom to give them. But all I really offer is space and silence, and they discover that in that space, their own wisdom can finally be heard. The wisdom was always there. It was just drowned out by noise and busyness. Solitude doesn't create wisdom. It reveals the wisdom that was hidden." The young man stayed for a week, and each day, Ryonan gave him less and less instruction. By the end of the week, they would sit together for hours without speaking, just being present to the silence and to each other. And the young man found that these silent hours taught him more than all the words he had heard in years of seeking teachers and reading books. When he left, he thanked Ryonan. "I thought you would teach me something. Instead, you showed me how to hear what I already knew." "That's the only teaching worth giving," Ryonan replied. As more years passed, Ryonan noticed an interesting pattern. The people who traveled to see him once rarely came back. It wasn't that they were disappointed, but rather that they had learned what they needed to learn. They had experienced solitude, discovered their own inner wisdom, and carried that back to their lives. They didn't need to keep returning because the teaching wasn't dependent on his physical presence. It was about a principle they could apply anywhere. A few visitors did return, usually in times of crisis or transition, and Ryanan always received them, but he noticed that these return visits were shorter. The people knew now how to create their own space, their own silence. They came not because they needed him specifically, but because his hut represented a physical manifestation of the inner solitude they were learning to cultivate. One day, an old friend from his academy days came to visit. This friend, whose name was Kenji, had become the head of the academy, achieving the position Ryanan could have had. He arrived looking exhausted, burdened by responsibility and expectation. "I've achieved everything we once talked about achieving," Kenji said. "I have the position, the respect, the influence. So why do I feel so empty?" Ryanan recognized this emptiness. It was what he had felt all those years ago, what had driven him to the mountains. "Because you have everything except space," Ryanan said. "Your life is so full of accomplishment that there's no room left for being. You've filled every moment with doing, and you've lost touch with the silence beneath all the doing." "But I can't just abandon everything," Kenji protested. "I have responsibilities. People depend on me." "I'm not suggesting you abandon anything," Ryanan replied. "I'm suggesting you find spaces within your full life where you can be empty, even brief moments of solitude, of silence, of stopping. These moments are not wasted time. They're the moments where you reconnect with who you are beneath all your roles and responsibilities." He stood up and walked to the edge of his small clearing. "I came to the mountains because I needed radical solitude to remember myself. But now I carry that solitude with me. Even when visitors are here, even when I'm engaged with others, there's a core of silence in me that remains untouched. That's what you need to find. Not external solitude necessarily, but internal solitude that you can access even in the middle of busyness." Kenji stayed for several days, and Ryanan taught him simple practices. Sitting in silence for even 10 minutes each morning. Taking a walk alone without purpose or destination. Eating one meal a day without distraction, just noticing the food and the act of eating. Creating small pockets of solitude within a busy life. When Kenji returned to the academy, he began implementing these practices, and he found that these small moments of solitude transformed his entire experience of his busy life. He was less reactive, more present, more capable of hearing his own wisdom beneath the noise of constant demands. He wrote to Ryanan, "I understand now what you've been teaching. Solitude isn't about being alone. It's about creating space. And that space is what allows wisdom to emerge, what allows us to hear truth, what allows us to be present rather than just constantly doing. Thank you for showing me that I didn't need to abandon my life. I just needed to find space within it." Ryanan smiled when he read this letter. This was the real teaching. Not that everyone should become a hermit, but that everyone needs solitude in some form. Space where they're not performing, not producing, not consuming, just being. As Reinin grew older, he noticed that fewer visitors came, not because his reputation had diminished, but because the teaching had spread. People had learned to create their own solitude, their own silence. They didn't need to journey to a hut in the mountains because they had learned to find that mountain stillness within themselves wherever they were. One evening, as Reinin sat watching the sunset from his hut, he reflected on the paradox of his life. He had retreated to solitude, seeking only to be alone, and in doing so, he had touched more lives than he ever had in his busy years at the academy. By wanting nothing, he had given something valuable. By seeking no students, he had taught countless people. By embracing emptiness, he had offered fullness. The teaching wasn't really his, he realized. It was simply what emerged when space was created. The wisdom people found when they visited him wasn't his wisdom. It was their own wisdom, finally audible in the silence he created around himself. He was just a mirror, reflecting back to people what they already knew but had forgotten in the noise of their busy lives. Tonight, as you rest, you're entering into solitude. Not the solitude of a hermit in the mountains, but the solitude of sleep, of withdrawal from the day's engagements, of stepping back from constant doing into simple being. In this solitude, you might find what busy people seek from hermits: space where your own wisdom can be heard, silence where truth can emerge, emptiness where fullness becomes apparent. You don't need to travel to mountains or build a hut or give up your life. You just need to create moments like this one. Moments where you stop filling every space with activity and allow silence to speak. The wisdom you're seeking isn't somewhere else. It's here in you, waiting to be heard. But it can only be heard in silence, in solitude, in the space you create by ceasing to be constantly busy. Rest now in the solitude of this moment. Let the silence teach you. Let the space fill you. What you've been seeking in all your busy engagement with the world is here, has always been here, waiting in the quiet. Solitude doesn't attract wisdom from outside. It reveals the wisdom that was always inside, just waiting for space to emerge. Be still, be silent, be empty, and discover that emptiness is the fullness you've been seeking all along. With each breath, we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen, where the smallest stone may hold the greatest truth. Here starts the next story. There was a master calligrapher named Yukiko who had devoted her entire life to the art of beautiful writing. For 60 years, she had practiced daily, creating works that were displayed in temples and palaces throughout the land. Her characters were considered the finest of her generation. But as she grew old, her hands began to shake. The tremor was slight at first, barely noticeable, but gradually it worsened, until she could no longer create the smooth flowing lines that had been her signature. The characters she wrote became jagged, uneven, broken by the involuntary movements of her aging hands. Yukiko was devastated. Calligraphy was not just her work, it was her identity, her life's purpose. She had defined herself through her art for 60 years. Now, unable to produce the quality of work she had maintained for decades, she felt her life was over. If she couldn't create beautiful calligraphy, what was she? She stopped taking commissions. She stopped teaching students. She sat in her studio, staring at blank paper, unable to bring herself to create imperfect work. Each day felt like waiting for death, as if her life had ended. even though her body continued. One day, a young calligrapher named Kenji came to visit her. He had studied her work and wanted to meet her before she died, as he had heard she was no longer creating. "Master Yukiko," he said, bowing deeply, "please, will you show me how you create such beautiful work?" "I can't," Yukiko replied bitterly. "My hands shake. I can no longer do what I once did. My time is over." "Show me anyway," Kenji persisted. "Show me what you do now, even if it's not what you once did." Reluctantly, to satisfy this persistent young man, Yukiko took up her brush. Her hand trembled as she moved it across the paper. The line broke and wavered. The character she was forming looked nothing like the smooth, perfect characters she had created for 60 years. But Kenji was staring at it with wonder. "This is extraordinary." "It's broken," Yukiko said. "It's everything I spent my life learning not to do." "It's alive," Kenji replied. "Your old work was perfect, but this has something your perfect work didn't have. It has a vulnerability. It has humanity. It shows the reality of the hand that made it, the tremor that comes with age, the imperfection that comes with being human. It's no less beautiful. It's beautiful in a different way." He pointed to specific places where the line broke. "See how this break creates a pause, a breath? See how this wobble adds energy, movement? You couldn't create these effects intentionally. They come from not being able to control everything, from allowing the reality of your condition to show." Yukiko looked at her shaky calligraphy with new eyes. She had been seeing only what it wasn't: smooth, controlled, perfect. She hadn't been seeing what it was: authentic, immediate, marked by the truth of her aging body. "You're saying my shaking hands aren't ending my art?" she asked. "They're changing it." "They're revealing a new possibility," Kenji said. "You've mastered perfection. You spent 60 years learning complete control. Now you're learning something else. How to create beauty without control. How to let your limitations become part of your art rather than obstacles to it. This isn't an ending. This is a beginning." Over the following months, Yukiko began to explore what Kenji had called a beginning. She stopped trying to fight against her tremor and started working with it. She let the shakiness show, let the broken lines be part of the aesthetic. Let her aging hands tell their own truth. The work she created was unlike anything she had done before. It had a raw quality, an honesty, a profound beauty that came from acceptance rather than mastery. People who saw it were moved in ways they couldn't quite explain. It touched something in them that perfect calligraphy never had. "Your new work feels more human," one viewer said. "The perfection was impressive, but this is relatable. This shows struggle and acceptance. This shows life as it actually is, not as we wish it to be." Other aging artists heard about Yukiko's transformation and came to see her. They too had been treating their declining abilities as endings, as tragedies that marked the end of their creative lives. Yukiko showed them something different. "What you call an ending is just a transition," she told a painter whose eyesight was failing. "You've lost what you had, yes, but loss creates space for something new. If you spend all your time mourning what's gone, you'll never discover what's trying to arrive." She showed them her shaky calligraphy. These tremors would have horrified me 5 years ago. I would have hidden this work in shame. But I've learned that every ending contains a beginning. My hands' steady control had to end before I could begin learning to create beauty from their unsteady truth. A sculptor whose arthritis had made detailed work impossible asked, "But how do you accept the loss? How do you stop grieving what you can no longer do?" "I still grieve it sometimes," Yukiko admitted. "I still miss the feeling of complete control, the satisfaction of executing exactly what I envisioned. But I've discovered something. The part of me that created perfect calligraphy was actually quite limited. It could only create what I consciously intended. Now, with my shaking hands, I create things I never could have planned. The imperfection introduces an element beyond my control, and that element often produces more interesting results than my intentions ever did." She held up a piece of her new work. "See this character? I intended it to look one way. My tremor made it look another way. And the way it actually looks is more compelling than what I planned. The beginning I'm in now includes accident, chance, collaboration with my body's wisdom rather than domination of it." Kenji, who continued to visit Yukiko regularly, said, "You've become a better artist by becoming worse at control. Your mastery now includes accepting what you can't master. That's a higher skill than perfect technique ever was." Yukiko nodded. "When I had complete control, I could only create versions of what I already knew. Now, with partial control, I'm discovering things I didn't know were possible. The ending of my old art was the beginning of art I couldn't have created any other way." A Zen master who collected calligraphy commissioned a piece from Yukiko. When she delivered it, with all its shaky lines and broken strokes, he hung it in his meditation hall's place of honor. "This shows the essence of Zen," he told his students. "Perfection is static, fixed, dead. This work is dynamic, alive, accepting of change and impermanence." The master's tremor isn't a flaw in the work. It's the work teaching its deepest truth. That beauty includes imperfection. The endings contain beginnings. That loss creates space for discovery. Yukiko lived another 15 years, creating what many considered her finest work during this period. Critics called her late style revolutionary, noting how it had influenced a generation of younger artists to embrace imperfection and vulnerability in their work. When she finally died at 85, still creating tremor-marked calligraphy to the end, her students gathered to remember her. They spoke of her two periods, the 60 years of perfect control and the 15 years of acknowledged tremor. "Which period was greater?" a young student asked. An older student replied, "She was always great." But she became wise only in her second period, when she learned that endings contain beginnings. When she discovered that what you lose forces you to find what you didn't know was there. When she understood that every door that closes reveals another door you weren't seeing before. Tonight, as you rest, what endings are you mourning? What losses are you treating as pure conclusions with nothing beyond them? What abilities, relationships, or circumstances have ended that you're grieving, as if ending means death rather than transition? Every ending contains a beginning you can't see yet. The closing of one possibility opens others that couldn't have opened if the first possibility had continued. Your losses aren't just subtractions. They're also additions of space. of new potential, of directions you couldn't have gone while the old way remained available. What's ending in you right now isn't your conclusion, it's your transition. Something is completing, so something else can begin. The tremor that seems to be ruining your perfect lines is actually creating new kinds of beauty you couldn't have achieved through control alone. Rest now in acceptance of endings as beginnings in disguise. What's leaving is making room. What's breaking is revealing. What's ending is beginning, just not in ways you can recognize yet. Trust the ending. It knows what it's doing. Every conclusion contains a hidden opening, and you're moving toward it even as you mourn what's closing behind you. Sleep now in the space between ending and beginning, knowing that this space itself is fertile ground where something unexpected and beautiful is already starting to grow. In a province divided by a deep gorge, there lived a master bridge builder named Kazuo. He had constructed bridges across rivers, over valleys, spanning impossible distances. His bridges were renowned for their strength and elegance. People traveled safely across waters and heights that would otherwise have been impassable, all thanks to Kazuo's skill and courage. But Kazuo harbored a secret that no one suspected. He was terrified of heights. This fear had been with him since childhood, since the day he had climbed too high in a tree and fallen, breaking his arm. The memory of that fall, the stomach-dropping sensation of nothing beneath him, had never left. Yet somehow, he had become a bridge builder, perhaps because he wanted to conquer this fear, or perhaps because he wanted to create safe passage for others over the very thing that terrified him. For years, Kazuo managed his fear through careful strategy. He would design the bridges in his workshop, calculate every measurement, supervise construction from solid ground. His apprentices would do the high work, walking the beams, securing the cables, testing the spans. Kazuo would stay below, calling instructions, his feet planted firmly on earth. His bridges were masterpieces of engineering. Each one stood as testament to his brilliant mind. But Kazuo knew the truth. He had never once walked across one of his own bridges. He had never felt the sway of the structure he designed. He had never looked down from the height his calculations assured was safe. This secret gnawed at him. He felt like a fraud. How could he call himself a master bridge builder if he was too afraid to cross his own creations? One spring, the provincial governor commissioned Kazuo to build his most ambitious bridge yet, a span across the deepest part of the gorge, connecting two mountain villages that had been isolated from each other for generations. The bridge would need to be long, high, and strong enough to withstand the winds that howled through the gorge. Kazuo accepted the commission. He drew the plans, made the calculations, selected the materials. Construction began, and as always, his apprentices did the high work while Kazuo supervised from below. The bridge took 2 years to complete. When it was finished, it was magnificent. A graceful arc of wood and rope and stone spanning the gorge like a prayer made solid. People came from distant villages just to see it. The day before the official opening ceremony, Kazuo stood at one end of the bridge, looking across to the other side. The governor had requested that Kazuo himself cut the ceremonial ribbon at the center of the span to honor his achievement. This would require Kazuo to walk halfway across his own bridge, in front of hundreds of witnesses. Kazuo felt his heart hammering in his chest. He looked down into the gorge, a distance that made his vision swim. He couldn't do it. He simply couldn't. That night, Kazuo didn't sleep. He lay in his bed, shame and fear warring inside him. By morning, he had decided he would tell the governor he was ill. He would send an apprentice to cut the ribbon. He would find some way to avoid the truth. But before dawn, there was a knock at his door. It was Yuki, his senior apprentice, a young woman who had worked with him for 5 years. "Master," she said, "I know your secret." Kazuo's face went pale. "What secret?" "Your fear of heights. I've known for years. We all have." Kazuo sat down heavily. "Then you know I'm a fraud." "No," Yuki said firmly. "I know you're human, but I also know something else. May I show you?" She led Kazuo to the bridge in the pre-dawn darkness. They stood at its entrance, looking across the span that was barely visible in the dim light. "Master," Yuki said, "may I tell you what I've learned working with you? Every bridge begins as fear. Fear of the gap, fear of the height, fear of the distance. That's why bridges exist, to address fear. You think your fear disqualifies you from building bridges, but actually, your fear is what makes you the best bridge builder I've ever known." "How can that be?" Kazuo asked. "I'm too afraid to even walk across them." "Exactly," Yuki replied. "Someone without fear might build a careless bridge. They might miscalculate, might miss a danger because they don't feel in their bones how high the stakes are. But you check every measurement 3 times. You select materials with obsessive care. You design with such caution, such attention to every possible failure point. Because you understand fear, your bridges are so safe precisely because you're so afraid." She stepped onto the bridge, her feet confident on the boards. "Come. Just 1 step." Kazuo took 1 step onto the bridge. His legs trembled. "The fear you're feeling," Yuki said. "Where is it? Is it in the bridge?" Kazuo looked down at the solid boards beneath his feet. "No, the bridge is fine." "Is it in the gorge? Is the gorge reaching up to hurt you?" "No." "So where is the fear?" Kazuo touched his chest. "It's in me. It's in my mind." "Yes," Yuki said gently. "The danger you fear exists only in your imagination. The bridge is real, the gorge is real, but the catastrophe you're imagining, the falling, the failing, the shame, that's not real. That's a story your mind is telling about what might happen, not what is happening." She took another step. "Come, 1 more step. Don't think about the whole bridge, just this 1 step." Kazuo took another step, then another. He kept his eyes on Yuki, on the boards directly beneath him, not looking down into the gorge, not thinking about the distance to the other side. "The fear says you'll fall," Yuki continued, walking slowly backward, leading him forward. "But have you fallen? The fear says you can't do this, but are you doing it?" Step by step, they moved across the bridge. Kazuo's breathing was ragged, his hands shaking, but he didn't stop. He focused only on the present step, the present board, the present moment. "The obstacle," Yuki said, "was never the height. It was never the gorge. It was the story in your mind about what the height and the gorge meant. The bridge you needed to cross wasn't this one. It was the gap between your fear and your action." They reached the center of the bridge. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten. Yuki stopped. "This is where you'll stand today," she said. "Where you'll cut the ribbon. Where you'll acknowledge your achievement. Can you do it?" Kazuo looked around, truly seeing for the first time where he stood. He was at the center of his own creation, high above the gorge, and he was not falling. The bridge held him. The structure he had designed was keeping him safe, just as he had calculated it would. "I built this," he said, wonder in his voice. "I built something strong enough to hold me, even though I was afraid." "You built more than a bridge," Yuki replied. "You built proof that fear doesn't have to stop creation. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but action in the presence of fear. Every bridge you've ever built was an act of courage, Master. You just couldn't see it because you were looking at your fear instead of your actions." They walked back across the bridge together as the sun rose. This time, Kazuo looked down into the gorge, really looked. It was deep, yes. The height was real, yes. But the bridge was also real. His knowledge was real. His years of careful calculation were real. The fear was just one truth among many, not the only truth. That afternoon, when the ceremony began, Kazuo walked across his bridge in front of hundreds of people. His hands still shook slightly. His heart still beat fast. The fear didn't disappear, but he walked anyway. And when he reached the center and cut the ceremonial ribbon, he felt something he had never felt before. Not the absence of fear, but freedom in spite of it. In the years that followed, Kazuo still felt fear when he crossed bridges, even his own. But he crossed them anyway. He learned that courage wasn't about being unafraid. It was about recognizing fear as a feeling, not a fact, as a story the mind tells, not a truth that must be obeyed. He would tell his students, "The obstacles that stop us are rarely as solid as they seem. Most of them are built not of stone and distance, but of belief and imagination. We think we can't, and so we don't try. We imagine failure so vividly that we mistake the imagination for reality. But if you take one step, then another, focusing only on what's real in this moment, rather than what's imagined about the future, you often find that the obstacle dissolves. It was never as solid as you believed." Tonight, as you rest, you might consider the bridges you haven't crossed because of fear. What obstacles exist primarily in your imagination? What catastrophes are you so certain will happen that you never test whether they're true? What would one step look like? Just one step, not the whole journey, just the present moment's possible action. Your mind will tell you stories about falling, failing, being hurt or humiliated. These stories feel so real that you mistake them for prophecy, but they're just stories. The present moment is offering you solid boards beneath your feet, a structure that can hold you, a possibility you've been afraid to test. The bridge is stronger than your fear of it, and you are stronger than the stories your mind tells about what you cannot do. Rest now in this truth. Let your fears be what they are, feelings, not facts. And know that tomorrow, if you choose, you can take one step onto a bridge you've been afraid to cross. Just one step. That's all courage ever requires. The path of Zen unfolds like morning mist, soft and patient. In this next tale, we are invited to see, beyond appearance, into essence. Listen carefully to the next story. In a village known for its beautiful gardens, there lived a gardener named Sora who had inherited a plot of land from her grandmother. It was good land, fertile soil, adequate water, positioned to receive both morning and afternoon sun. Sora's neighbors on every side had transformed their properties into showcases of horticultural ambition. There were formal gardens with meticulously pruned trees, vegetable gardens yielding abundant crops, flower gardens that bloomed in careful succession throughout the seasons. But Sora's plot remained empty. Month after month, season after season, year after year, Sora did nothing with her land. She didn't plant, she didn't build, she didn't design or plan or cultivate. She simply left it alone. The neighbors whispered about this. What a waste, they said. Such good land going unused. Some thought Sora was lazy. Others thought she was confused, perhaps not knowing how to garden. A few felt insulted, as if Sora's empty plot was a criticism of their own elaborate efforts. One neighbor, a proud man named Takeshi, whose garden featured rare specimens from distant provinces, finally confronted Sora one spring morning. "Excuse me," he said, his tone barely polite, "but don't you think you should do something with your land? It's an eyesore, frankly, just weeds and wild grass. You're bringing down the beauty of the whole neighborhood." Sora, who had been sitting on her porch drinking tea, smiled gently. "What would you suggest I plant?" "Well, anything," Takeshi gestured expansively. "Vegetables, flowers, trees. Something useful or beautiful. Something that shows you care." "Come," Sora said, standing up. "Let me show you something." She led Takeshi into her supposedly empty plot, but as they walked among the unmown grass and untamed growth, Takeshi began to notice things he hadn't seen from a distance. There were wild flowers he had never seen in cultivated gardens, small, delicate blooms that seemed to glow in the morning light. There were butterflies of species he'd never encountered in his own carefully managed space. Birds nested in the natural tangles of vegetation, singing songs that his pruned and ordered trees never hosted. "Look here," Sora said, kneeling by a patch of plants. "These herbs grow wild here. They're medicinal. I gather them for the village doctor. And see this area? In autumn, mushrooms appear here that are delicious and valuable. I don't plant them. They simply come because the conditions are right." She stood and walked further into the space. "This grass that looks so messy to you, it's habitat for insects that pollinate crops for miles around. Those weeds you mentioned, several are actually rare native plants that have disappeared from cultivated areas. They only survive here because I don't pull them out." Takeshi looked around with new eyes. What he had seen as neglected chaos was actually a thriving ecosystem. What he had judged as emptiness was actually fullness of a different kind. "But you didn't plant any of this," he said, still confused. "You didn't make it happen." "Exactly," Sora replied. "I didn't plant because the land knew better than I did what should grow here. My grandmother taught me this. She said, sometimes the wisest action is to do nothing, not from laziness, but from trust. Trust that nature has its own intelligence. Trust that things want to grow. Trust that not every space needs to be controlled and designed and managed." She bent down and touched the wild grass gently. "If I had planted a formal garden, I would be fighting against this land's nature. I would pull these native plants to make room for what I decided should be here. I would disrupt the birds and butterflies. I would impose my idea of beauty onto something that already has its own beauty. And I would be working constantly, weeding, watering, pruning, managing. Instead, I do almost nothing, and look what abundance appears. Takeshi was quiet for a long moment. He thought about his own garden, the hours of work it demanded, the constant vigilance against anything growing where he hadn't planned, the way he fought against the land's own tendencies to maintain his vision of order and beauty. "But don't you want to create something?" he asked. "Don't you want to make your mark?" "I am making my mark," Sora said. "I'm making it by not making it. I'm creating space for things to be what they naturally are, rather than forcing them to be what I think they should be." My grandmother said this too. Wu Wei, action through non-action. The doing that comes from not doing. This is not the same as doing nothing. This is carefully doing nothing, intentionally not interfering, wisely allowing. Over the following months, Takeshi found himself visiting Sora's wild plot more often. There was something restful about it, something his own controlled garden didn't offer. In his garden, every plant was in its place, every edge was trimmed, everything was as it should be, according to his plan. It was beautiful, but it was also rigid, tense. It required constant maintenance to prevent nature from asserting its own ideas. In Sora's plot, everything was relaxed. Plants grew where they wanted. Animals came and went freely. The whole space had a quality of natural ease that invited him to ease as well. One day he asked Sora, "How do you know when to act and when not to act? How do you know when doing nothing is wisdom and when it's just avoidance?" Sora thought about this carefully. "I watch," she said. "I pay attention. When I see something struggling that needs help, I help. When I see something growing well on its own, I leave it alone. When I see an invasive plant that will choke out everything else, I remove it. But most of the time, I just watch and trust. The land tells me what it needs. I don't impose my ideas onto it." She smiled. "You know the difference in your own life, don't you? Sometimes you push when pushing is needed. Sometimes you rest when rest is needed. Sometimes you act. Sometimes you wait. The wisdom is in knowing which is which. Not having a rule that you must always act or must always do nothing, but being present enough to sense what this particular moment is asking for." Years passed. Sora's plot remained unplanted, but it became known throughout the region as a refuge for rare plants and animals. Scientists visited to study the species that had disappeared from more cultivated areas but thrived in her space. Children came to see the butterflies and birds. People feeling stressed would sit at the edge of her property, finding peace in its wild beauty. Takeshi gradually changed his approach to his own garden. He didn't abandon it entirely, but he created areas where he did less, managed less, controlled less. And he was surprised to find that these areas often became his favorites. The places where unexpected beauty appeared, where nature revealed its own intelligence. One evening, sitting with Sora on her porch, looking out at her wild plot as fireflies began to light up the dusk, Takeshi said, "I used to think you were lazy. Now I understand you were wise. You saw that not every space needs to be filled. Not every plan needs to be executed. Not every action needs to be taken. Sometimes the most productive thing we can do is create space and then get out of the way. Sora nodded. My grandmother had one more saying. The usefulness of a cup is in its emptiness. The usefulness of a house is in its empty space. The usefulness of action is in the space around it where non-action lives. You cannot act wisely if you're always acting. You cannot create room for things to grow if you're always filling every space with your own ideas. She sipped her tea, watching the fireflies. I didn't plant this garden, but I tended it through my not planting. I created it through my not creating, and what appeared was more beautiful, more alive, more true than anything I could have forced into being. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider where in your life you're overacting, over-planning, over-controlling. Where are you filling space that might be better left empty? Where are you imposing your will onto something that has its own wisdom? Where are you so busy doing that you've forgotten the power of allowing? Rest itself is a practice of productive non-action. You don't make yourself sleep. You create conditions for sleep and then get out of the way. You don't force relaxation. You allow it by ceasing to prevent it. Let yourself be like Sora's empty garden tonight, unplanted, unmanaged, allowed to be what it naturally wants to be. Trust that things want to grow, want to rest, want to restore themselves. Your job isn't to force this process, but to create space for it, and then wisely, carefully, intentionally do nothing at all. Sometimes the most productive thing you can do is nothing. And sometimes doing nothing is the hardest, most important work of all. In the hush of understanding, Zen offers us another glimpse of what it means to recognize worth not by weight or shine, but by presence. Here starts the next story. At the edge of a farming village stood a mountain that had always been there, as far back as anyone's memory reached. It wasn't a particularly large mountain, but it cast a shadow over the village's fields each afternoon, shortening the growing season and limiting what the farmers could cultivate. The villagers had long accepted this as simply the way things were. The mountain was immovable. It had been there since time beyond memory. Complaining about it was like complaining about the sky or the sea. But there lived in the village an old woman named Uma, who had a different way of looking at things. One morning, the village headman was surprised to see Ume walking to the mountain carrying a small basket. He watched as she filled the basket with stones and soil from the mountain's base, carried it to the far edge of the village and emptied it. Then she walked back and did it again. "Ume-san," the headman called out. "What are you doing?" "I'm moving the mountain," Uma replied simply, filling her basket again. The headman laughed, thinking she was joking. But didn't laugh. She carried her basket to the far edge of the village, emptied it, and returned for another load. Over the following days, people noticed that continued this pattern. Every morning, she would make trip after trip, carrying small amounts of earth and stone from the mountain to the village edge. Each basket held perhaps as much as could fit in 2 hands. Each trip took about 10 minutes there and back. People began to talk about it. Some thought she'd lost her mind. Others thought it was a harmless eccentricity of old age. A few found it inspiring in a quixotic way, though none joined her in the work. Ume's grandson, Kenji, was embarrassed. "Grandmother," he said one evening, "people are laughing at you. You're trying to move a mountain with a basket. You're wasting your time. The mountain will still be there long after you're gone." Ume looked at him with those eyes that had seen 7 decades of life. "Perhaps," she said, "but it will be a smaller mountain. And if others join me, it will be smaller still. And if they don't join me, well, I'll spend my remaining years doing something I believe in, rather than doing nothing because the task seems too large." "But you'll never finish." "No," agreed, "I won't. But I'm not trying to finish. I'm just doing what can be done today. Today, I can move many baskets of earth. Tomorrow, I can move many more. The mountain doesn't have to be gone for my work to matter." She pointed to the path she had been walking between the mountain and the village edge. "See? The path is already becoming smoother from my feet. That's one change. And that pile of earth I've been building, small plants are beginning to grow in it. That's another change. The mountain itself, if you look carefully at the base where I've been working, you can see a small difference already. These are real changes, even if they're small." Kenji looked at his grandmother with new eyes. He had been measuring her work against the impossible goal of moving the entire mountain, but she was measuring it differently, by what could actually be done each day, and the small, real changes that resulted. The next morning, Kenji showed up with his own basket. "I can't move a mountain," he told his grandmother, "but I can move many baskets." They worked together, and the work felt different to Kenji than he expected. There was something meditative about it. The simple repetition, the clear, physical progress of each trip, the way the pile on the village edge grew visibly day by day. Within a week, 3 other villagers joined them. They didn't believe the mountain would be moved exactly, but they were moved by Ume's determination, and they discovered what she already knew. There was satisfaction in doing a small thing consistently, even if the ultimate goal seemed impossibly distant. Within a month, 12 people had joined. They organized themselves, creating a relay system that was more efficient than each person making the full round trip. Children got involved, carrying small amounts. Some people could only help for a few minutes each day, but those minutes added up. A traveling monk passed through the village and, seeing this unusual activity, asked what was happening. "The old woman is moving the mountain," someone told him, pointing at Uma. The monk walked over to where Ume was filling her basket and sat down beside her. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "Because the mountain blocks the light from our fields," Ume said. "And because it can be done." "But surely you don't think you can move the entire mountain?" "I don't know what I can ultimately accomplish," Uma replied, "but I know what I can do today. Today, I can move this basket of earth from here to there. Tomorrow, I can do the same. If I do this every day, change happens. Maybe small change. Maybe not the complete change I might wish for, but change nonetheless." She stood up, her basket full, ready for another trip. Most people don't attempt good things because they don't believe they can finish them. But finishing isn't the point. Beginning is the point. Continuing is the point. Making whatever progress is possible is the point. The monk watched her walk away with her basket and found himself picking up a basket too. A year passed. The mountain was still a mountain. But the base where the villagers had been working was noticeably different. Perhaps 3 feet of height had been removed from that section. The pile on the village edge had become a small hill itself, and farmers were already using it to expand their growing space. More importantly, something had changed in the village itself. People had discovered that huge things could be approached through small, consistent actions. Problems that had seemed immovable could at least be moved a little. And moving something a little was better than standing still in despair or resignation. A farmer began applying this principle to a field that had been choked with stones. Everyone had always said it was impossible to farm, too many rocks. But the farmer began removing one stone at a time, day after day. Within 2 years, the field was productive. A craftsman who had always dreamed of mastering a complex technique, but thought he was too old to learn, began practicing for just an hour each day. Within 3 years, he had developed real skill. The village began to change, not because the mountain was gone, it wasn't, but because people had learned something from Ume's example. Impossibility is often just the sum of many possible small actions that no one has been willing to take consistently. 5 years after began her work, she passed away in her sleep. By that time, a significant section of the mountain's base had been moved, and the shadow it cast was measurably smaller. The growing season in the affected fields had lengthened by nearly a month. At her funeral, the village headman spoke. Ume-san taught us that we are not powerless in the face of large obstacles. We are not required to move mountains overnight. We are only required to move what we can move today. And if we do that, day after day, mountains do move. Perhaps slowly, perhaps incompletely, but they move. 20 years later, travelers coming to the village would notice something unusual about the mountain. One entire side of it was significantly lower than the other and continued to be worked on by villagers who had made it a tradition. They no longer asked whether they would finish. They simply carried their baskets, knowing that their small daily actions were part of something larger than themselves. The mountain, which had seemed eternal and immovable, had proven to be neither. It was simply a very large pile of earth and stone, and any pile, no matter how large, can be moved one basket at a time if someone has the patience to keep moving baskets. Tonight, as you rest, you might think about the mountains in your own life, the problems that seem too large, the changes that seem impossible, the goals that seem unreachable. You don't have to move these mountains tonight. You don't have to solve these problems completely. You just have to carry one basket when morning comes, and then another, and another. Great changes don't happen through massive single efforts. They happen through small, consistent actions that seem insignificant in the moment, but accumulate into something transformative over time. Rest now in the knowledge that you don't have to do everything. You don't have to achieve completion. You just have to move what can be moved today, and trust that small movements, repeated faithfully, are how all mountains eventually move. As the lantern of awareness glows a little brighter, we come to a tale about seeing with more than the eyes. Let the stillness guide you now, and listen carefully to the next story.